Good morning. This is Deborah Flora sitting in for my colleague, George Brauchler. I'm sure it did not take you long to realize I'm not George Brauchler. I really enjoyed being here this morning. I've got my cup of coffee. I hope you do as well. My show is heard weekdays, Monday through Friday, 3 to 4 p.m. And yes, I'll be on the air again this afternoon with special guest Laura Carno of Faster, Colorado, talking about this really sharp increase in Americans who own firearms and how that just really perplexes the left, which is very amusing. So we're going to talk about that this afternoon, as well as talking about how we can protect our kids in school, because that's really a very, very important topic that I know is on many people's hearts. But this morning we have 4 hours together, and I am so looking forward to it. We're going to have a great lineup coming up in the next hour at 7 o'clock. We're going to have Rob Natelson. He is a constitutional expert. He's with the Independence Institute, someone who's been quoted numerous times, over 39 times in Supreme Court cases. We're going to talk to him coming up, a little bit of an overview of some of the really big wins that we've had in the Supreme Court, but also about the renewed attack by Democrats to try to delegitimize the Supreme Court. And in fact, the Senate Democrats have introduced something that's very Orwellian in how it's sounding. It's supposed to be to hold the Supreme Court justices accountable, but all it really does is put them in a politicized position where they will then be second-guessing every decision. They are supposed to be separate, be treated differently for a reason. So we're going to be talking with Rob Natelson when we come up in the 7 o'clock hour. 8 o'clock, we're going to have Luke Niforatos, and he is the executive director of Smart Approaches to Marijuana. The reason why we're going to talk about that is because he's a national speaker on this, lives right here in Colorado, frequently featured on many national news channels, and Colorado obviously is used as a case study when he is testifying all around the country. And why this is so important is not just because of the use of marijuana itself, but because of what's happening to young people here in our state. I'm a mom. Anyone who listens to my show knows that that's one of the things that really gets me going, gets my dander up, and also gets me passionate about what we can do and what we need to take care of here in our state and in our country. And I frequently have conversations with other moms where they share a story of a young person, high school age or younger sometimes, who has gotten their hands on marijuana and has actually gotten to the point where they've even had a psychotic break. Many people don't know that marijuana itself right now is 400% more potent from 1995 to 2018. It's not your mother's, your father's, your grandfather's marijuana. No, it has changed. So it's good to be informed. And that's why we're going to have Luke coming up in the 8 o'clock hour. And then at 9 o'clock, we're going to have Elaine Parker. She is the president of Job Creators Network Foundation. Elaine is one of the people that led the charge to the Supreme Court to stop Joe Biden's school loan debt redistribution scheme. I know that's not a catchy phrase, but that's what it really is. And we're going to talk about why that was a big win, but we're also going to talk about how the resident of the White House and those surrounding him are trying to circumvent the Supreme Court. Boy, both of these linking from the attempt to delegitimize the Supreme Court, and then now Biden trying to go around it and do his own school loan debt redistribution again, shows why the different branches of government, the checks and balances, are so very important. Well, one of the things I love about talk radio right here on 710 KNUS, I'm Deborah Flora, if you're just tuning in, sitting in for my colleague George Brauchler, is because free speech is essential. It's kind of what I want to talk about this hour. And if you want to call in and exercise your free speech, we'll be taking calls starting in this second segment. And that will be 303-696-1971, 303-696-1971. That'll be an opportunity for you to exercise your free speech. Tell me what kept you up last night? What gets your dander up? What is on your mind this Friday? So I want to kick it off, though, because free speech is something that is probably one of the most essential cornerstones of our liberty. That is why it is the First Amendment, protected by the Second Amendment. They go hand in hand. Yesterday, by the way, on my show, the Deborah Flora Show, and you can hear any of those podcasts at 710knus.com. That's 710knus.com. Just go to my show page. I had Lori Smith on the show. She is the founder of 303 Creative, who just had a huge win in the Supreme Court for free speech and against government-compelled speech. These are the two sides of the same coin. Are you free to speak as your conscience demands, what is on your heart? And the other side of that coin is, can government compel you to say something that you don't believe? They are essential and they go hand in hand. And it's an interesting time that we are in now, because I'm going to share some examples of where speaking freely or refusing to exercise government compelled speech is leading to a greater and greater vitriolic backlash. To me, that simply shows it is not time to retreat from speaking the truth. It's time to press in even further, because our rights, there's a reason why they say we have to exercise our rights. It's like a muscle. We don't exercise them. We don't use them. We lose them. We have to exercise our rights, and free speech is essential. I want to talk about a couple of things, but I want to frame this because, there's many great quotes about free speech and why it is essential. Here's one. Our founding father, one of them, George Washington, said, "If the freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter." We often can forget, I know not these great listeners, you guys here on 710 KNUS, but our founding fathers and mothers were so incredibly serious about our rights because they were living under a totalitarian regime. They were living under a monarchy. They knew that in this current situation throughout the entire world, you would speak, and if the king didn't like it, or whoever was that totalitarian leader, well, that was it. You had no right. So he knew how important it was. But it doesn't just stop there. You go on and you hear about things like George Orwell and his absolutely prescient 1984. I think he missed it by about 40 years. We're about to come into 2024, and we're approaching many of the things that he warned about. He said, "In a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." I'm sure many of you have felt shut down. Many of you have felt that if you say something, you're going to be attacked. I've never experienced it like I have in the last 3 weeks. And here's an example. Those of you that listen to my show know that I felt very honored to lead the rally in front of the Supreme Court steps December 5th when the 303 Creative case was being heard in the building right behind us. And I had also led the rally in 2019 for the case Nifla versus Becerra. And I'm going to tell you the difference in those two time periods. 2019, just 4 years ago, this was the case Nifla versus Becerra, where Becerra, who's now head of Health and Human Services for the Biden administration, he was then the Attorney General for California, they were trying to force pregnancy resource centers, those who are giving women an option, they were compelling them to advertise for abortion. Literally, they passed a law saying pregnancy resource centers had to put a big sign in their waiting room, basically saying, "Hey, for your free abortion, go here, call this number." Now, the reality is that's compelled speech. That case was correctly decided and ruled against Becerra and that Orwellian Ministry of Truth compelled speech that they were trying to do there. It was interesting because when I led that rally, the opposing side had their own platform. They put it over next to ours, their own podium, their own mic. They led their own rally. Now, they did turn their speakers directly at us and had bullhorns and all this trying to silence us. And I did have to warn our kids who came. I have 2 wonderful children, my husband and I do. Had to tell them they're going to hear some things that, normally we don't talk about in our home, but they were good. But at least there was an effort for both sides to present their views. And I'm all for that. I'm all for someone who disagrees to actually be out there speaking their own viewpoint. That's the public square, because we believe in a free republic. Both sides can present their information, their facts, and then let the people decide. Empower them to make the decision in that marketplace of ideas. In fact, I love this quote by Alan Dershowitz. He is a Harvard Law School professor, constitutional law expert. He's actually a Democrat. I would say now he's probably just middle of the road, no longer really what is considered to be a Democrat. I think the Democrat Party left him a long time ago. But here's what Alan Dershowitz says about free speech. Freedom of speech means freedom for those who you despise and freedom to express the most despicable views. It also means the government cannot pick and choose which expressions to authorize and which to prevent. That's very key. Because let's say somebody says really something racist and heinous, not everything now that today that's immediately knee-jerk called racist, but something truly racist. Well, in a free society with free speech, everybody has a right to hear it if they want to and say, my goodness gracious, that is despicable. I'm not going to listen anymore. That's the best way, because then as a society, we all get to determine, no, that's just not acceptable. And that is the way it should be. But today, there's this increasing idea that disagreement is hate speech. Disagreement is not hate speech. I was at an event last week that was really phenomenal. It was a Liberty Summit, and I was out all week, and Riley Gaines was there again. I've interviewed her on my show. She is the world acclaimed, amazing championship swimmer who tied with Leah Thomas. And then they gave Leah Thomas the trophy instead because they needed a photo op. That's literally what they told her. And she is speaking freely. But it's interesting. One of the things she said is biology is not bigotry. Disagreement is not hate speech. That's what Alan Dershowitz was getting at. And that's a very important point, because today we're getting to that point where they just want to shut down free speech. So fast forward this story, tale of two Supreme Court rallies. So one in 2019, at least the other side showed up and tried to express some viewpoint. I found most of their remarks absolutely nonsensical, but that's okay. That's okay. They have a right to express it. This year, this December 5th, when the 303 creative case was being heard and I was leading the rally in front of the Supreme Court steps, it was completely different in just 4 years. The opposing side did not bother to get a permit. They did not bother to get their own podium, their own microphone, have their own points that they wanted to make. Instead, there was a very, very aggressive group of about 10 to 12 people. It really was not more than that. And their entire goal was not to speak freely, but to stop free speech. They did everything they could with bullhorns, with loud music, which was basically, this is, I'll give you the abbreviated version. The loud music they kept playing was F you, F you, F you, F you over and over and over again, hardly advancing the cause of free speech. And I realized there is a portion of our society that does not want free speech. They want less speech, not more speech. They want to shut down all opposing viewpoints. And I don't believe that's the vast majority of Americans, but that is the temperature in which we find ourselves, to the point that when we were having this rally for free speech against the government compelled speech, a lot of people want to frame this, by the way, as Christians versus the LGBT community. Nothing could be further from the truth. In that rally, we had an Orthodox rabbi, a Muslim, an atheist. We had people supporting us who were from the LGBT community. They actually call themselves LGB community for the most part, because many people believe the transgender part has taken it in an entirely different direction. That's another conversation for another time. But when the Orthodox rabbi got through speaking and he stepped out from outside of our protective circle, because believe me, the people that were there for our rally, and we had well over 100, had to almost lock arms to keep this more violent group from charging in. And they were very, very restrained, because all that those who want to cancel others were looking for was one photo op where one of our people pushed them. That never happened, but they did lock arms. Well, this rabbi steps out of the circle. He's heading back towards home, having bravely spoken up in support of free speech and against government compelled speech. And what did these I don't even know. I don't want to call them protesters, so they weren't even protesters. These silencers. What did they do? They surrounded him with bullhorns and started calling him a Nazi. I mean, that is what we're facing. And that is why speaking freely is really the charge of every single citizen today. To talk with our neighbors, to lower the temperature, to let people remember again that disagreement is not hate speech. Disagreement is not discrimination. In fact, we are a pluralistic society. I have an op-ed that I wrote about this that's in the Denver Gazette and the Colorado Gazette. You can find it on my social media pages at Deb Flora Show, on Facebook, the Deborah Flora Show, and on Twitter at Deborah Flora 1. And I encourage you to read it because it really talks about the fact that the goal, as actually Justice Gorsuch said in his ruling in favor of 303 Creative, in our society, it's tolerance, not coercion. Time we take these phrases back. And I love this, by the way, one of my favorite quotes when we are looking at the time that we're in. Not only the quote by George Orwell that I shared, in a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. We've got to be like George Washington, the first revolutionaries who were not afraid to speak the truth, because as George Washington said, if we don't, we will be led dumb and silent like sheep to the slaughter. Another great quote is by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And if you aren't familiar with him, I'm sure most of you are. He was the Soviet dissident who dared to speak out and was put in a gulag for quite a long period of time. And he said this. He said, "One man who stops lying can bring down a tyranny." What if we all just spoke freely? What if we were not cowed by what happens on social media? And by the way, sometimes it can get to be really fun because when I spoke up at our school board in Douglas County before we flipped it, and I spoke up just because I was spitting mad, had my dander up as a mom, found out there was secretive training going on. They claimed that there was no CRT being taught, and then this leaked training came out. And what was it? It was a training by a group called the Gemini Group, and it was literally teaching teachers how to basically separate students, teach them that if you're a white cisgender male, you're an oppressor. If you are, you've got more melanin in your skin, you're an oppressed. I mean, it's the definition of CRT. But the thing that got me was in the training, they were telling teachers and educators how to get around having parents find out. They referred to parents as dissenters. Well, that got my goat, as it should. Stood up, made, let people know what I thought, dared to quote Martin Luther King Jr. about children, his dream that his 4 young children would be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And no, that is not cultural misappropriation, because he was a pastor. I'm a Christian. He was a human being. I'm a human being. He was someone who stood for, the real civil rights movement, as we all do. But what was so funny, and this comes to the silencing part, as soon as I was done and I suddenly realized it was broadcast, and then I found out Ben Shapiro had retweeted it, and then it went viral, I looked at my husband and I asked him, I said, let's just count the seconds till somebody calls me racist. And it was 3, 2, 1. Oh, there it is. It happened within a couple of seconds. But we can have fun with it. So when people would do that, I would simply say things like, wow, that's prejudice of you. You don't even know me. Have a nice day. And they wouldn't even continue because they didn't know what to make of it. But my favorite, and try this out. If anybody says to you online when you were just speaking truthfully, we can speak the truth in love, as the Bible talks about. I believe in that. We don't have to hit people over the head. But when you do, and somebody pulls this one, which is one of my favorite, where they say, shame on you, as though they're a grandmother and you're a naughty toddler, just try this comment. Whenever somebody says shame on you to me because I dare to speak truth, and by the way, there is such a thing as objective truth. It's not your truth, my truth. That's your experience, my experience, your perspective, my perspective. But there is such a thing as objective truth. And that's what I strive to find. But when I do that and somebody says, shame on you, here's what I love saying. I'm sorry. I don't receive your shame. Have a nice day. They just don't know what to do with it. It is so much fun. So let's have fun with it. Have to head to a break. When we come back, we're going to open up the phone lines. If you have had your coffee and you want to freely speak, we're going to give you that opportunity. 303-696-1971. 303-696-1971. You can also text through the free 710 KNUS app. And when we come back, we're going to share a couple of examples of the latest attempt to silence speech and why we have to have the backs of these people who are speaking freely. Don't go anywhere. I'm Deborah Flora, sitting in for my colleague George Brauchler on News Talk 710 KNUS.
Want to take your favorite radio station wherever you go? Well, now there's an app for that. No matter where you are, stream your favorite shows. Tap the app to listen to podcasts. Talk back to your favorite local hosts.
At the tone, leave a message.
Call the show. Set your alarm. Enter contests and win prizes, all in the palm of your hand. Available now for iOS and Android devices in the App Store or Google Play. And best of all, it's free. Download today.
Welcome back to the George Brauchler Show. This is not George Brauchler, as you probably guessed. This is Deborah Flora sitting in for my colleague George Brauchler. Had to come back from the break with that song, Try That in a Small Town, Jason Aldean's new release. The reason why is, first of all, it's a great song. Love the sound and the feel of it. Secondly, as most of you probably know, it is the center of the latest fury and flurry to cancel. And it's a perfect example of how when the left wants to cancel something, they simply make things up. The first thing is they always throw the word racist at it. They throw the word, I don't know, whatever word they want to throw at it. That's what they do to simply try to shut down a different viewpoint. We've been talking about that, the importance of free speech, and want to continue that conversation. If you missed any of the first part of the show, had some great quotes from some really brilliant minds throughout time about why free speech is so important. And let's just take this for example. As we know, liberals are trying, leftists, I don't even call them liberals because classic liberalism is what I think most of us espouse, which is the idea of live and let live, that we want most of all to have a free society where we don't have to agree on everything. That's the point of the 303 Creative Supreme Court case. Freedom from forced orthodoxy and compelled speech and ideological conformity. So leftists are trying to cancel the song by Jason Aldean, and they say things like it's racist or it's calling for violence. Actually, nothing is further from the truth. When you look through the lyrics, as I have and many of you have, there is not one mention of race in the entire thing. Now, I do think there are some people in our culture that have been so conditioned to see racism everywhere they look, to see hate everywhere they look, that some of them may actually be triggered by this. Fortunately, those watching online can see me using my finger air quotes because triggered is something that really it's called just learning to be okay with disagreement. But anyway, the fact is this is the perfect latest example of the left's attempt to cancel something just because they don't like it or they don't agree with it. When you look throughout the words, all that Jason Aldean is doing is he's talking about how what was allowed in 2020, the burning summer, we saw it right here in Colorado. And by the way, next week on my own show, which is heard Monday through Friday, 3 to 4, I'm going to have Ron McLaughlin and Casper Stockham on the show because we're going to talk about a lawsuit they're filing. And they'll be in court on Thursday. They'll be on my show on Wednesday because of what happened downtown in Civic Center Park. I was there. It was the 6th annual Support the Police rally. A few hundred of us showed up. It was a family gathering, pretty much just over 100. We were then descended upon right after the Pledge of Allegiance by hundreds of Antifa, and people were getting beaten over the head. That is what was happening in those summers. Lest we forget that there were over $1 million worth of damage, 20 to 200 people vandalizing just Denver itself in the days after the George Floyd situation. Well, what Jason Aldean is saying is try that in a small town. What was allowed by people in cities like Denver, where they defaced the people's house, the courthouse, with profanity that was horrendous. And what was the response of our governor? I'm not in Denver. I don't even know about it. Well, that's inexcusable. So that's all he's saying. And when he talks about, they talk about, it's a violent song. It talks about guns. Here's the one part that actually talks about a gun. These are some of the lyrics from Jason Aldean's from his song. Got a gun that my granddad gave me. They say one day they're gonna round up. Well, that blank might fly in the city. Good luck. Try that in a small town. What he's talking about rounding up is the attempt of the left saying that they're going to register guns and round up the guns. So it's time we push back. And here's something that I love about all of this as well. When you look at the hypocrisy, you have things like, as Charlie Kirk pointed out, WAP, however you want to say it, by Cardi B, which is one of the most graphic. It sexualizes women, even though a woman's singing it. It talks about all kinds of violence. It's horrible. Nobody calls that out. But a song that's actually talking about how in a small town we take care of our own. We won't let this happen. That's why many people move to a small town. And by the way, my mom and dad were raised in a small town. My husband was raised in a small town. In fact, he laughs and says that there was actually 2 stoplights in the town that he grew up in. And then his father became sheriff of a 1 stoplight town. The reality is there is an ethic there that is missing in many of our cities. And that is an ethic that the left wants to slam. Here's something I love too. Aldine's wife, Brittany, I love that she not only is supporting her husband, but she went on social media. She shared a selfie of both of them on the beach, and she wrote this: "Never apologize for speaking the truth." That sums it up. Never apologize for speaking the truth. She also went on her Instagram post and she wrote and said, "Media, it's the same song and dance. Twist everything you can to fit your repulsive narrative. How about instead of creating stories, I mean, in others making it out of thin air, we focus on the real ones, such as child trafficking, food for thought." There you go. Sums it up. Hey, I want to continue with this, but want to make sure we take care of this caller who has called in. Jim, you are on the George Brauchler Show with Deborah Flora. Thanks for calling in. Hello, Jim. Are you there? Okay, I think we might have lost Jim, but thanks, Jim, for calling in. Just heard from a caller who texted in. It says, please. Oh, this person is calling me out. Well, that's fine. It says, "Isn't it interesting that everything you said about liberals, I think about whatever you are." And you know what? Whoever this is texting in, I stand up for your right to think that. I stand up for your right to text that in. I stand up for your right to disagree. And being a liberal, a classic liberal, is a positive thing. Classic liberals now really are right of center, who are basically saying, look, by the way, let me frame this by saying, I'm a Christian, I'm a conservative, I grew up in a military family, I believe in the Second Amendment, but guess what? I don't believe anyone else has to believe in any of those things. In fact, I'm so confident in those views that if we have a free marketplace where we can talk about it, then guess what? I believe if what I believe is true, I believe it'll win out in that conversation if we're allowed to have it. But what I find interesting is the people who want to shut down conversation. Let's just remember, any kind of name calling, which is childish, is kind of like saying you've got cooties and running away on the playground. That is simply an attempt to shut down conversation. It used to be when people knew how to debate, they would know the minute that someone calls someone else a name, the minute that someone loses their temper, the minute that someone gets emotional, that's when they've lost the debate. I love to debate with people when it comes to the actual facts. So thank you for texting in. I support your right to say all of that, but I disagree. There you go. Classic liberalism. And by the way, whoever texted that, I encourage you to go listen to my show that I had with Eric Sonderman. Eric Sonderman is a Democrat. He writes for Colorado Politics and several other publications. He actually supported the 303 creative case, even though he's a Democrat, even though he's got a son who's gay, even though he supports gay marriage, which is fine. And by the way, gay marriage is not going away in the wake of the 303 creative case. And anyone who's having a wedding of any sort can get a cake or a website. There's thousands. But I had him on the show because we tried to demonstrate what classic liberalism looks like. We didn't agree on everything, but we 100% agreed with the fact that we had a right to speak freely or not be compelled to speak. We have to head to a break. We're coming to the next break here. This is flying along. But when we come back, we're gonna talk about this interesting comment that Jason Aldean's wife said. Instead of creating stories about him and his song and lifting up the merits of small towns where everyone protects one another and knows one another, by the way, that's a good thing. Many people don't even know their neighbors, let alone know what they really think. They just judge them by a label or a yard sign. But she said, how about instead focusing on child trafficking? When we come back, we're going to talk about Sound of Freedom. We're going to talk about how that is making a huge impact, just crossed $100 million at the box office. I'm going to tell you why that is record-breaking. We know the director, Alejandro Monteverde, and the producer, Eduardo Verástegui, great people. Also know Jim Caviezel. Going to talk about that and why that is a repudiation of the mainstream media, once again, that is now even trying to vilify a movie about child trafficking. If we can't all come together on that, that shows you something about our society. But I think we can. It's simply those from a leftist perspective that are speaking loudly, that are trying to silence others. We're not going to let that happen. We're going to exercise our First Amendment rights. So there you go. When we come back, we'll continue this conversation. I'll also read some texts that are coming in, and feel free to call in 303-696-1971, 303-696-1971. I'm Deborah Flora, sitting in for my colleague, George Brauchler. News Talk.
Imagine the lifelong impact of a journey to the Holy Land, surrounded by like-minded travelers. Picture yourself stepping foot in iconic locations right out of history. With nationally syndicated radio hosts Dennis Prager and Mike Gallagher, you'll gain firsthand understanding of the spiritual and political importance of this vital region.
Hi, it's Mike Gallagher here. I hope you'll join Dennis Prager and me on an amazing journey through Israel in October 2023.
Discover Israel's vibrant culture and why this nation is such a strategic partner for the United States. Join Dennis Prager and Mike Gallagher on this life-enriching Israel tour, October 25th through November 3rd, 2023. For more information, call 855-565-5519 or visit standwithisraeltour.com.
Welcome back to the George Brauchler Show. I'm Deborah Flora, sitting in for my colleague George. My show is heard Monday through Friday, 3 to 4 p.m. But great to be here with you this morning. My goodness, must be the coffee because this first hour has gone quickly. Good to be here with you all. Also, by the way, want to make sure to invite you to our third annual Dennis Prager Cigar Night. It is going to be a wonderful evening, great conversation. Your ticket will include hors d'oeuvres, a carving station, first beverage, and of course, great premium cigars. It wouldn't be a cigar night with Dennis Prager without it. Seating is limited, so please get your tickets and complete details at 710knus.com. Hope to see you there. It's going to be a great evening, always a highlight, and always great to gather together. I often say on my own show, Liberty loves company. So that's the place to be. So we have been talking a lot about free speech. We're talking about the two sides of the coin. Free speech, the right to speak whatever is on your heart and your mind. And then the other side of that coin is being free from government-compelled speech. Had Lori Smith from 303 Creative on my own show yesterday, along with ADF attorney Kelly Fedoruk. You can always hear any of those interviews on the website 710knus.com and go listen to the podcast. And we've got a caller calling in. Jay from Douglas County, you're on the George Brauchler Show with Deborah Flora.
Oh, good morning. How are you?
I'm good. How are you this morning?
Great. Beautiful morning, actually.
It
We have
is.
fog everywhere.
It's
So cool.
It is crazy. I tell you, I've always said that Colorado is schizophrenic, but this season more than most. But what's on your mind this morning, Jay?
I just have a quick question about the your position on the artists that in the the 303, and of course Jack, making cakes and so forth. They're going after us, but you notice they didn't go into a King Soopers or a Safeway and ask them to make an obtrusive cake.
Yep.
They picked on a little guy, a great guy actually.
Yes, he is.
Some of the fundraisers with Casey and Peter Boyles way back when. So let me ask you this. How do we countermand these actions? And it's all the way up the line where we're hearing the economy's great, everything's perfect. Well, you go to the grocery store and nobody's buying steak. Nobody's buying, hardly anything of high value. And I feel so bad for folks that are on fixed incomes, retired, being hammered by these costs. And I'm looking at $4 gas as I'm speaking to you driving.
Right. Well, no, that's a great question, Jay. And you hit on really the action step I always end up every single show with, which is we have to be the ones to talk to our neighbors and help them connect the dots when it comes to things like the economy. I mean, most people know when Joe Biden says something like, oh, this is, the economy's going great. Most people know. There's actually an interesting George Orwell quote. I don't have it in front of me, so it's going to be an approximation. But he said, the party said to ignore the evidence of your eyes and your ears. That was their final, most imperative command. Well, most of our neighbors are seeing with their eyes and their ears and their pocketbooks what's really going on. And I think we have to be the ones to talk to them to say, this is why this is happening. And I think that because they're not going to hear from the mainstream media, they're not all going to tune into stations like this necessarily. So our job here on the station is to equip people to go out and talk to their neighbors. When we're in the grocery store and people are staring at the meat that has gone up, 100%, 200%, whatever it is, man, we can have that conversation and just say these policies are crazy, that we've got to change something because we've got to prepare people to connect the dots between what they're experiencing and how they're going to vote. That's my thought about that. I'll give you the last word.
I just wanted to give a big shout out to the fact that you grew up at Lowry Air Force Base.
I sure did.
And I was the fortunate student of, I'm trying to find him, Master Sergeant Major Ed Henley was the highest ranking NCO.
Wow.
Probably maybe worked with your father, black man, best instructor I ever had.
That's great.
For avionics school, and I just love that place.
Yeah.
In the 30s, my family members who fought in the war went to the same schools that I did at Lowry.
Wow, that's great.
What was your father's same last name? Flora?
No. He was a lieutenant colonel, retired, has since passed away, and he was Lieutenant Colonel Richard Ricks. That was his name. I'm going to have to head to a break, but Jay, thank you for your service. Thank you for bringing back great memories from Lowry. I really appreciate it. You have a great day. Thank you. And Jay brings up a really great point about Jack Phillips. I just wanted to say something about that. one of the ways we can countermand these narratives and these attempts to cancel is to basically vote with our dollars. Go to businesses, listen to Jason Aldean's music, go and get amazing cakes and cookies. He's got the best oatmeal cookies, in all of Colorado, I believe. Go and do that. And Jack's business is going well because people understand. First of all, he's excellent at what he does. And secondly, he has a right to say no. What's so ironic about this case, and so we can be armed to talk to our neighbors, at the same exact time that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission was telling Jack he had to make a cake, there was somebody trying to force him to make a cake of Satan smoking marijuana, a gender transitioning cake, a same-sex wedding cake. At the same time they were saying he had to do that, they were rightly standing up for the right of atheist bakers not to be forced to bake cake with scripture on it. But it's hypocritical because the minute that you have government-approved speech being sanctioned and anyone who goes against the government orthodoxy being targeted, we have lost free speech. And we cannot go there. Boy, so much to talk about. We didn't even get to Sound of Freedom. We will talk about that later in the show. But coming up at the next hour, I'm going to have Rob Natelson with me. He is a constitutional expert. We're going to talk about the attacks on the Supreme Court. Got to stand up for the Supreme Court also. It's currently saving our republic. Don't go anywhere. I'm Deborah Flora, News Talk 710 KNUS. Welcome to the George Brauchler Show. Probably didn't take you long to realize I'm not George Brauchler. No, I'm Deborah Flora, sitting in for my colleague George. My show is heard Monday through Friday, 3 to 4 p.m., but great to be with you this morning. I tell you, Blake in the booth and coffee, and we are just rocking and rolling. It is amazing how that first hour went so quickly. If you missed any of that conversation or any of the shows, go to our website, 710knus.com. You can hear the podcast from this morning already. It will be up later today, and also you can hear my shows that are also available there. And one of the interviews I had this week that we're going to talk about with my next guest, Lori Smith, 303 Creative, and her Alliance Defending Freedom attorney, Kelly Fedoruk, joined me to talk about the incredible attacks that are going on in the wake of this ruling and a few others, but she's personally being attacked, and it's just really inexcusable. But someone who knows better than really almost anyone the Constitution, the reason why the Supreme Court is so important, is my next guest, and that is Rob Natelson. He is the Independence Institute's Senior Fellow in Constitutional Jurisprudence. He heads the Institute's Article 5 Information Center. He was a law professor for 25 years, writings in Epoch Times and many other publications, and he has been cited 39 times in Supreme Court cases, 11 times in 3 cases this term alone by Justice Thomas. Rob, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it very much, Deborah, and greetings from Columbia Falls, Montana, where I am today.
Well, it sounds beautiful. What's the weather like there, Rob?
The weather here is clear and hot.
Okay,
really quite hot.
There you go.
But it's beautiful.
Good.
It's beautiful here. We're kind of near the gateway of Glacier National Park.
Oh, that is gorgeous. I got to tell you, this Rocky Mountain region, I will take it over a beach any day of the week, unless it's a beach in Grand Lake where you've got both, and it's great.
Yes.
Thank you for calling in all the way from Montana and being a part of this conversation. I appreciate it. And you joined me on my show a couple of weeks ago to talk really in depth about some of the rulings this past season. And since then, this session, there have been some huge attacks. Let's just, first of all, talk about a couple of the cases that I want to highlight that really the left did not like the direction that they went. And now the attacks are really coming on the court itself. And I want to talk with you particularly about that part of it, because you clearly know more than most why it is so important to have 3 separate branches. But let's first talk, by the way, you had some interesting insights on the 303 Creative case. Why don't you share with listeners your thoughts about that case and the way that the Supreme Court ruled on it?
Before I go to 303 Creative, which was a great victory,
yes,
I need to make a point that people really need to hear, because they're getting a lot of misinformation. The misinformation is that this is a conservative court, or that this is a court with a 6-3 majority. In fact, as the decisions this term demonstrate, and the decisions last term demonstrate, this is in fact a fractured court. You've got 3 solid liberal activists. You have nobody who is a conservative activist in the sense that Sonia Sotomayor is a liberal activist.
Yes.
The other justices are across the political spectrum. In a series of columns for the Epoch Times, which you can now find on the Independence Institute website, I identify 10 cases, important cases, in which the court interpreted the Constitution, or if the Constitution wasn't under direct analysis, they had important constitutional implications. Of those 10, the so-called conservative side won 4, the so-called liberal side won 5, and the other one is really, really hard to classify. And so you can see that this is really a fractured court. This is not some hard right conservative court, which makes the attacks coming out of Congress on the court even less excusable.
Well, it is, and we'll get to that, and I appreciate your framing it that way. But you're right; it is amazing. Then it shows how there is a part of our political elite that cannot stand to have even one thing not go their direction.
That's right.
Yes,
that's right.
So we'll get to that after we touch on these cases. But thank you for framing the conversation that way. I think it's very important for people to hear. So give us your thoughts on the 303 Creative case.
Well, I think by 303 Creative was interesting. It's usually counted as a conservative victory. I would count it as a victory for the Constitution.
Indeed.
For First Amendment freedoms. This was an interesting case. If you recall back a few years ago, when Jack Phillips of Masterpiece Cake Shop was being persecuted, he argued that forcing him to make cakes for same-sex weddings in violation of his Christian beliefs violated his religion rights. This case, however, was fought on different grounds. It was fought on freedom of speech grounds.
Yes.
Lori Smith said that forcing her to design websites for same-sex marriage violated her freedom of speech rights, and that led in the case to a lengthy division among the court. This is speech. We acknowledge that, but on the other hand, she's doing this as part of her job. She's making money. It's commercial speech. Therefore, maybe it should be protected less. And the three liberal dissenters said, yeah, it's speech, but it's only commercial speech. My take, which you said was unusual, but I think it's accurate, is that if you dropped one of the founders into this case today, he would say, this is not a free speech case at all.
Right.
This is a freedom of the press case. This is a freedom of, you see, even though we didn't have the internet at the founding era, we had a basic principle. And that basic principle is direct speech. Two people in the same room, somebody giving an oration, that's freedom of speech. But speaking through a medium, whether it be a newspaper or a placard or a pamphlet or the internet or broadcasting, actually would be classified as freedom of the press because it's done in a way, and this is the critical distinction for the founders, it's done in a way that is preservable. It just doesn't disappear. This transcript can be recorded and can be played again and again. God help us.
More coffee, please.
and heard by millions of people. So that would be put in the freedom of the press box, so to speak. Now, the reason why that's important is that in the area of freedom of the press, it doesn't matter whether it's commercial or not. I mean, most newspapers get full protection, yet they're for-profit enterprises.
Right.
So that whole discussion would have been unnecessary. I published this theme in the Federalist Society Review, and it's been very well received. I don't think a lot of people have, they haven't really looked at the founding era understanding of freedom of the press and freedom of speech. And so it hadn't really occurred to them.
Yeah, and by the way, that's a very interesting point because the editorial that I did on this, or the guest column I did on this, and what I shared when I was leading the rally in front of the Supreme Court steps was from the perspective of being a filmmaker. My husband and I have a media company. We are documentarians, and not being forced to communicate a message in our, as you say, preserved work is in a way freedom of the press. We have a right to create something, and yes.
Yeah, in fact, when the founders talked and the people in the founding generation talked about the freedom of the press, one of the aspects they spoke of freedom of press is artistic expression.
There you
exactly
go.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So either way, it's a win. But I think that is,
it's a win.
And by the way, the very fact that this was a win for freedom of the press as well as freedom of speech shows how the three dissenters really are so against the Constitution. I mean, because if this had not been ruled that way, then the government would have been able to compel an atheist to make a, website for a Christian organization, or force an LGBTQ designer to make a logo for a Catholic traditional marriage seminar. I mean, it's just stunning to me. Yeah,
they wouldn't do that.
Right. Well, because they're on the other side.
They would change the rules.
Yeah, they would.
They would change the rules. Part of what the one reason this was a federal issue is because during the 20th century, liberal courts decided that the First Amendment applied to the states, even though the First Amendment actually only identifies Congress as the target of it.
Right.
So it's based upon liberal courts. So what you see in some of these hard left characters in Congress is they're saying, well, yeah, we acknowledge that back in the 20th century, we were in favor of freedom of the press when it could be used by communists and other subversives. But I mean, the different rule applies to Christians. I mean,
right. Oh, of course, of course.
when it comes to conservative Christians or conservatives generally, we can change the rules. I mean, that seems to be their attitude.
Oh, it is. It is. It would have got, well, that was the attitude of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission that said Jack had to bake a cake against his beliefs, but the atheist baker, and this is an actual situation, did not have to bake a cake with scripture on it.
Yep.
So it was hypocritical. Yep. And I love the point that Alan Dershowitz makes, which is basically that free speech is primarily for that speech you don't agree with. If we don't protect that, then there is no such thing as free speech. There's only government-sanctioned speech, which is, it's the hallmark of any totalitarian regime, basically.
Yeah.
One more case I want to talk about before we get to the larger issue, which is the attack on the Supreme Court. Coming up at 9 o'clock, I'm going to have Elaine Parker on the show with me. She's from Job Creators Network Foundation. They're the ones that started the suit against Biden's school loan debt redistribution scheme. I have to call it that because forgiveness is a kind word that misinterprets what it really was. Give us in a nutshell your view on that case.
You mean on the student loan forgiveness case? Yes,
correct.
Well, this was not actually a constitutional issue, which is where my focus is. It's more of an interpretation of a statute. But essentially what the court said is that let me back up just a second. There is a practice these days, and this is one of the reasons we have problems with our federal government. The practice is that Congress will pass these very broad omnibus statutes, to create something like the General Welfare Commission and give the General Welfare Commission power to regulate everything for the general welfare. And then when people complain about it, then the congressman will take credit for correcting the problem. It's a game that they play.
Yes, indeed.
And so in the student loan statute, you've got the president having widespread authority to modify the terms of the loans. Well, the Biden administration, by forgiving what were really hundreds of billions of dollars in student loans, said, well, we're just modifying the terms of it. And the court, which is a little bit more skeptical of the administrative state than previous courts, has said, well, no, this is not a modification. You're rewriting the statute entirely. Now, I personally believe the entire student loan program is unconstitutional. I think this is an area for the states to participate, like other aspects of education. However, and this is an area, again, where you've got to mix the good with the bad. This court, unlike the court led by Chief Justice Rehnquist a few years ago, is unwilling to challenge congressional power. I mean, if I had been writing that decision, I would have said, I question whether this whole program is constitutional.
Right.
They didn't do that. And in fact, in another case, they put their imprimatur on an extension of the commerce power beyond anything that's been done before. And so this is not a court that's willing to challenge Congress, but they are willing to challenge the administrative agencies and the executive branch when it acts under a congressional statute.
Yeah.
The Biden administration's action would have been viewed by the people who founded our government as an absolute abomination.
Right.
They drafted the Constitution in part to prevent that sort of nonsense.
Yeah, without a doubt. And it definitely was a big rebuke of the overreach of the executive branch and a protection of this separation of powers, which is a very good thing. We're going to talk with Elaine Parker at 9 o'clock about Biden continuing to basically say this can't stand. We can't let this be the last word. And now he's trying to go around it, which is once again just a gross overreach and ignoring of the very reason why we have checks and balances. The minute that someone in the executive branch can just do all of these things by fiat, especially when the purse strings and the money aspects are controlled by the House of Representatives, it just shows all the more why we need it. We're going to head to a break now, Rob, but when we come back, what I want to get to now in the wake of some of these rulings, as you said, this is a divided court. It is not truly a conservative court. But there is a portion of our political elite that absolutely cannot stand anything that they disagree with becoming a ruling. And now there's a full onslaught attack on the Supreme Court itself. So when we come back, I want to talk about that and why that would be such a detriment to freedom for everybody. So thank you for staying on the line, Rob. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Well, when we come back, we'll continue with my guest, Rob Natelson. He is a constitutional expert, someone who's been quoted and cited 39 times in Supreme Court cases, including 11 times by Justice Thomas, who is particularly being targeted by those who don't like these rulings, which are really just constitutional. It's interesting. You don't see people on the right really, targeting the Supreme Court for rulings that we've disagreed with. So when we come back, we're going to talk about this attack, particularly in the Senate, where they are introducing and trying to introduce legislation that would politicize the Supreme Court. Don't go anywhere. We'll continue this conversation when we come back. I'm Deborah Flora, sitting in for my colleague, George Brauchler, News Talk 710 KNUS.
Want to take your favorite radio station wherever you go? Well, now there's an app for that. No matter where you are, stream your favorite shows. Tap the app to listen to podcasts. Talk back to your favorite local hosts.
At the tone, leave a message.
Call the show. Set your alarm. Enter contests and win prizes, all in the palm of your hand. Available now for iOS and Android devices in the App Store or Google Play. And best of all, it's free. Download today.
Welcome back to the George Brauchler Show. I'm Deborah Flora, sitting in for my colleague George this morning. Already this time is going so quickly. I hope that your day is off to a great start. We're talking about the fact that in many ways there are a few cases that the Supreme Court just heard that have really saved our republic in some ways, most particularly, as my guest has been talking about, the 303 creative win is both a win for free speech and freedom of the press, which it really more applies to. But it is interesting that a court that is divided, there's a part of our leftist political elite that if they don't agree with one case, they want to take down the court. That's what's going on. That's why I'm glad to have my guest continue with me, Rob Natelson. He is a constitutional expert. He was a law professor for 25 years. He is now with the Independent Institute. He is the senior fellow in constitutional jurisprudence. Rob, thank you so much for continuing on the show today. I greatly appreciate it.
Great to be back with you, Deborah.
Absolutely. Well, now I want to get to what is happening. You've been on my show, which was great. We did a deep dive into some of the decisions, and anyone can hear that on my podcast right after the session closed. But now let's talk about what's happening in the wake of it. The Senate Democrats are introducing legislation that really politicizes the High Court. It's called the Supreme Court Ethics, Recusal, and Transparency Act. It sounds good, but let's talk about why the Supreme Court was set up differently and why this could be really a dangerous move forward. Why don't you give us your perspective on that, Rob?
Well, first, this controversy illustrates how the dominant media work hand in glove with the leftists in government. Mm-hmm. Earlier in the earlier segment, we talked about the claim that this is a conservative Supreme Court or has a 6-3 conservative majority. That was basically, as far as I can determine, invented by the dominant media, mm-hmm. and a few conservative groups who have financial interest in that characterization have also promoted it. But it's an example of how they could create this narrative. Then some of the dominant media started finding what they characterized as ethics problems among justices, some justices, such as Thomas and Alito. Mm-hmm. They have not been able to identify any example of a conflict of interest where the judge actually was deciding a matter in which he or she had a personal interest, but they designated it as ethics, as ethical violations anyway. So mm-hmm. then a group of people in Congress, and it also, by the way, has been going on in the House,
yes,
have introduced legislation which purports to be ethics legislation, but which is probably better called the Supreme Court Intimidation Act of
yeah, exactly.
of 2023, right? And what it does is it sets up a system whereby anybody can file a complaint against a Supreme Court justice, not just for the violation of a code of ethics, but, and I'm quoting from the House version of the bill, if the complainant claims that a Supreme Court justice has, quote, otherwise engaged in conduct that undermines the integrity of the Supreme Court of the United States, otherwise engaged in conduct that undermines the integrity of the Supreme Court of the United States. So somebody can file a complaint on the grounds that he didn't like the way the judge voted in a particular decision.
Right. Who defines it? Yes.
Right. And so now the way the left is organized in this country is you've got this constant funding stream. Much of this funding stream is taken from us, the taxpayers. Some of it comes from people like George Soros and other nonprofits and nonprofits. They've got this constant funding stream. They can, as you know, raise a flash mob in an instant. I mean, they can burn down a whole section of a city over some invented grievance and do so like overnight. Mm-hmm. They can put threatening mobs in front of Supreme Court justices' homes overnight. Mm-hmm. They can also flood the Supreme Court with ethics complaints and thereby seek to intimidate the court. There's one other part of this law which nobody mentions that I find very interesting. The bill also says that any organization that files a friend of the court brief, an amicus curiae brief, right, mm-hmm. to help the court make the decision, that is done by the consent of both parties, that organization has to reveal all of its donors who've given more than 3%. Right. So take the Independence Institute, the organization with which I'm affiliated.
Right.
During the Obamacare case, we actually won 3 of the 4 issues, and we submitted briefs on 2 of those issues. We've had a long history of success of submitting friend of the court briefs on constitutional issues, on gun issues, and so forth. Their goal is, of course, to learn the names of our donors so they can intimidate them, so they can put their own flash mobs in front of their houses, send them nasty letters, make threatening phone calls against them, threaten their lives, perhaps do attempted assassinations like they try to do with Brett Kavanaugh. Right. And so we're dealing, unfortunately, in this country with a large group of people who are basically thugs. There's no polite way to put it.
Well, it's a mob mentality. Yes.
It's a mob mentality.
Yeah. Well, and
it's also a thuggish mentality.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And I find it interesting. I love the fact that you call this the Supreme Court Intimidation Act, because there was no outrage from the same group of people when definitely illegally there were people that were targeting, threatening, with weapons, etc., Supreme Court justices after the leak, which was also unprecedented and incredibly damaging, the leak of the Dobbs ruling in advance. Where is the outrage protecting them versus this intimidation tactic? I think the other thing that's interesting, Rob, and if you're just tuning in, Deborah Flora sitting in for George Brauchler, my guest, Rob Natelson, constitutional expert with the Independence Institute. I also was reading that what they would want to put in place is a 5-member panel of chief judges from circuit courts that would be kind of the reviewers of any complaints. But the problem with that is those are the very people who their rulings may go up to the Supreme Court and get overturned. So talk about the fact that go ahead.
Yeah, so any chief judge would have an incentive to validate a complaint against someone on the Supreme Court who has recently reversed his decision.
Yes.
I mean, you could see the potentials for payback. Gee, he reversed my decision, so we're going to, and to be honest here, it's probably not going to be conscious. I mean, a chief judge of the circuit court is not going to say to himself, I'm going to get this guy with an ethics complaint because he reversed me. The problem is it's going to create unconscious incentives, which will mess up the system.
Here's a last. No, go ahead. Sorry.
It really is a piece of work, and just like its primary spokesman in the Senate, Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democrat from Rhode Island, he's kind of a piece of work. He starts lecturing us about non-existent conflicts of interest when he himself, as you can find by Googling him, has been the subject of repeated conflict of interest complaints.
Well, and that is a very interesting situation. And by the way, I do want to bring this up because there was an ethics situation that I think should be examined, perhaps. I'd love to get your thoughts on this. It's actually Justice Sotomayor. When she came before she joined the High Court, her investments were about $50,000 to $115,000. Now they're reported in a short amount of time as close to $6.4 million. The income for a justice is $285,400, and there is potentially a real conflict there. Her money has primarily come from books that have been published by Random House. Her staff frequently pushes those books, and she has not recused herself from cases that have involved Random House. Now, something like that, it's interesting. They're all talking about Alito or Thomas. But there is potentially a real ethics situation right there with Sotomayor. I mean, anyone, by the way, who comes into service, whether it's Nancy Pelosi, who's now worth $200 million and makes over $200,000 a year, or Sotomayor, who went from at a high $115,000 in investments to now $6.4 million. I mean, is there a place for some sort of ethics investigation?
Oh yeah, sure there is at some point, but this is a selective attack.
Right.
I'll give you another example. Sheldon Whitehouse, who we identified a minute ago. He sits on the environmental committee in the Senate, and he trades in Tesla stocks. And Tesla, of course, is a major beneficiary of federal environmental laws. And so, yeah, there's a lot of that going on, and has for many years. I mean,
Right.
when Lyndon Johnson entered the Senate, he was penniless, and by the time he became president, he, or more precisely, his wife was a multi-millionaire.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a long history of this, and at the risk of playing the same record over and over again, a lot of it is inherent. A lot of it is incurable.
Yes.
As long as you have a federal government as large and as intrusive as we have, and
Right.
the best way to cure that is to reduce the size of the federal government. It's not the only answer, but it's the biggest piece of the answer.
Yeah, it is indeed. And I think that sums it up from a constitutional perspective. Let's get back to limited government the way it was intended to be, the separation of powers the way it is intended to be, and not have an executive branch that's trying to rule by fiat and has been rebuked on that. Rob, thank you again so much for coming on and bringing clarity to this. Let listeners know once again where they can see some of those articles that you've been writing about these issues.
Well, the easiest place to see the stuff I write is at independenceinstitute.org. Independenceinstitute.org, click on the Constitution tab. And I also have a book out there, which is available through Barnes & Noble or Amazon, called The Original Constitution, What It Actually Said and Meant. It's an objective look at what the Constitution really meant right after the adoption of the Bill of Rights in 1791. Explains all these terms which you didn't know, and maybe even didn't know that had hidden meanings in them.
Can we send those, by the way, to Sotomayor and some of the others who maybe haven't actually read the Constitution?
When I was a constitutional law professor, there was a joke among constitutional law professors that went, "I don't have my students read the Constitution, it only confuses them." That shows you how far constitutional law studies are from the Constitution itself.
Oh, my goodness gracious. Well, thank you. Thank you for being a voice of reason in this time where we need to get back to some secure principles. I appreciate it. You take care, Rob.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Well, that was my guest, Rob Natelson with the Independence Institute, someone who has been cited 39 times in Supreme Court cases talking about what the real meaning is. And when we come back, we will open up the phone lines, 303-696-1971, 303-696-1971. Also, before we head to the break, I want to invite you, please join us for our third annual Dennis Prager Cigar Night. It is a wonderful evening of like-minded conversation. Your tickets will include hors d'oeuvres, a carving station, first beverage, and of course, premium cigars. It would not be a cigar night without that. But seating is limited, so please get your tickets. It will be at the View House in Centennial. You can get your tickets and complete details at 710knus.com. That's 710knus.com. We'll open up the phone lines when we come back, 303-696-1971, and also read some texts that are coming in through our free 710 KNUS app. Don't go anywhere. I'm Deborah Flora, News Talk 710 KNUS. Welcome back to the George Brauchler Show. I'm Deborah Flora, not George. And boy, that music makes me feel like my coffee's really kicking in. I hope you're already having a great day. We're having a wonderful conversation here, and I'm now very happy to welcome onto the show Brian with Alpine Planning. Brian, thanks so much for calling in this morning. Tell us what's going on.
Hey, Deborah, how you doing this morning? I think this is the first time we've had a chance to talk.
Well, it's long overdue, my friend. I'm so glad for this opportunity and all you have to share with us. I'm all ears.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's take a look at these markets today. We're kind of jumping all around. Currently, we got the Dow down 15 points. It's been positive most of the morning, but kind of settled down here the past 10 minutes or so. S&P is in the green. It's up 9.96, and the Nasdaq's up 54 points. So we take a look at what happened yesterday. The Dow notched its ninth straight day with the win, while the Nasdaq had one of its worst days since September of 2001. So not a really good day there. It was also revealed yesterday that Warren Buffett, the master, his firm now has a $180 billion stake in Apple. So a lot of people like to follow what Warren's doing, so that should give you a pretty good idea right there. What drove the Nasdaq down yesterday was basically Tesla and Netflix. Their earnings came out. They did not meet expectations. And then consumer confidence, it actually jumped in the month of July. It was up 13%. That's the second straight month that we've had improvements. And that index has also reached its high since September of 21 as well. People always ask, what makes up the Consumer Confidence Index? And what they're tracking there is personal finances, business conditions, and then buying conditions of the consumer. So, we talk about a lot of this with George. You got to be in the market if you want to make some money, but you got to have a good allocation. So if anybody's looking to sit down and get a second opinion on their portfolios, by all means, give us a call. We'd love to sit down and talk with you.
That sounds great. Well, I appreciate it. I'm always glad for people who know a lot more about this than I do. And that is definitely you, Brian, and the great folks at Alpine Planning. Thanks for calling in this morning. I appreciate it.
Okay, Deborah.
Take care.
Securities and investment advisory services offered through Woodbury Financial Services, Inc., member FINRA SIPC and registered investment advisor. Alpine Planning Group and Woodbury Financial Services, Inc. are not affiliated entities. 14 West Dry Creek Circle, Littleton, Colorado, 80120.
Well, we really appreciate that, the great folks at Alpine Planning and all that they do. And certainly there seems to be a sunny disposition towards the consumer outlook, just like the beautiful weather today. I tell you, I don't know if any of you had this experience, but with this crazy weather we're having 2 nights ago on Wednesday evening, that major thunderstorm. I don't know how many of you remember the movie Poltergeist, but it was terrifying when I saw it, that stage in my life. And there's this point where they tell you to count between the lightning and the thunder, and however many seconds you count, that's how many miles away the storm is. Well, that was happening on Wednesday evening, and it got to a point where we were that finally there were no seconds in between. They both happened at the same time. Huge, huge sound. And the loudest sound I've heard since being in the middle of an earthquake, actually. That's the only sound that was even louder. And awoke to find out that a tree had gotten struck down by lightning right behind our house on the Greenbelt. So it was pretty crazy. Had some weird dreams that night. So I don't know about you, but I'm experiencing this crazy weather, but happy for the sunshine today. Well, already having a great show. If you missed the first hour, we were talking a lot about freedom of speech and censorship and why we have to stand up against that. I shared this great quote by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and he said, "One man who stopped lying could bring down a tyranny." That's why we've got to stand behind people who are boldly speaking the truth. not getting, basically bullied into silence. And, there was a caller that called in because I talked about how I like to have fun with people who try to shout me down by calling a name. It's kind of like, oh, cooties, and then they run away on a playground set and don't have any point to make. And I said, especially when someone says something like, oh, shame on you, what I have been saying is, I'm sorry, I don't accept your shame. Have a nice day. And it usually leaves people without a comeback at all, and they just leave because they realize they haven't bullied me into silence. One listener texted, and I love this. They said, never apologize for speaking the truth. Instead of saying, I'm sorry, I don't accept your shame, just say, I don't accept your shame. Good day. Don't apologize to the leftists. I love that. Thank you. Always working on fine-tuning my quippy comebacks. And that was a really good input. We also just had a very insightful interview with Rob Natelson, constitutional expert. And we were talking about how in the wake of the Supreme Court rulings, such as the 303 Creative case, which is a win for everyone against compelled speech, no matter whether you agree with someone or you don't. The win against the Biden school loan debt redistribution scheme, that's my long term because I don't accept the utopian names they like to give things such as forgiveness. It's, yes, there is an issue obviously with school loan debt, but that's on the backs of the colleges that have been sitting on over $700 billion, I think it is, dollars of endowments, or 700 million. I have to look that fact up, but it's a lot of money. They're sitting on it while they are raising their tuition prices like crazy. And then it's on the backs of students that frequently graduate without even a degree that they can get a job in. And we're going to have a great conversation with Elaine Parker coming in the 9 o'clock hour. She is with Job Creators Network Foundation, the organization that led one of the lawsuits against this overreach of the executive branch. We also have talked about even the race-based college admissions got overturned. And it's interesting, when you look at the fact that Sandra Day O'Connor was a swing vote in the landmark ruling in 2003, and even she said within 25 years, we hopefully don't need affirmative action, race-based admissions in colleges anymore. I think we do not have enough time this hour. I'll play it hopefully somewhere in the show. I unearthed a clip that was really hard to find of then candidate for president Barack Obama echoing the same exact sentiments with George Stephanopoulos. And he actually said when he was running for office that his daughters should not be treated by the color of their skin because they were privileged, that there is a hope that affirmative action will basically be a diminishing tool, not needed anymore. So it's interesting that in the wake of these rulings that are actually very constitutional, what is going on is an all-out press by the leftist elite in politics, being led in the Senate right now, to discredit and politicize the Supreme Court. That is why this upcoming election is so important. We have to keep one of those beachheads, the House of Representatives or the Senate, which we're very likely to retake, and hopefully the presidency, so we can protect our separation of powers. Don't go anywhere. When we come back, we're going to have a very interesting conversation about smart approaches to marijuana. Yep, as a mom, I'm seeing the devastation amongst young people, and we need to get the word out. Don't go anywhere. I'm Deborah Flora, News Talk 710 KNUS, sitting in for George Brauchler.
Imagine the lifelong impact of a journey to the Holy Land, surrounded by like-minded travelers. Picture yourself stepping foot in iconic locations right out of history. With nationally syndicated radio hosts Dennis Prager and Mike Gallagher, you'll gain firsthand understanding of the spiritual and political importance of this vital region.
Hi, it's Mike Gallagher here. I hope you'll join Dennis Prager and me on an amazing journey through Israel in October 2023.
Discover Israel's vibrant culture and why this nation is such a strategic partner for the United States. Join Dennis Prager and Mike Gallagher on this life-enriching Israel tour, October 25th through November 3rd, 2023. For more information, call 855-565-5519 or visit standwithisraeltour.com.
Welcome to The George Show. I'm Deborah Flora, sitting in for my colleague, George Brauchler. My show is heard Monday through Friday, 3 to 4 p.m. It'll also be on again this afternoon at 3, after a bit more coffee, I think, because we've already been on the air since 6 a.m., but it's a great day. Anytime we can have a conversation on the free airwaves, it is a great day in this republic. And we are continuing the show. It's going so quickly, and I hope that your day is already off to a great start as well. My guest coming up, we have a topic I want to talk about. Many people who listen to my show know that I am a mom. I started Parents United America. My husband and I made the documentary, Whose Children Are They? I am always moved and activated when it comes to things dealing with families and with children. And recently I have been having conversations, our kids are now teenagers, with a lot of moms. And most of those moms know at least one child, and I call anyone under 18 a child. They are a young person, but they are not legally able to drive, to drink. But I've been hearing so many cases of young people who are using marijuana and having actual psychotic breaks, to the point where I've had a lot of moms asking me what the heck is going on. Well, that's why I was so excited to get connected with my next guest, because we're going to talk about this, because education is a huge part of what we need to do, especially in a state like Colorado where marijuana has been legalized. So I'm happy to welcome my guest, Luke Niforatos. He is the Executive Vice President of Smart Approaches to Marijuana. That is SAM. That spells out SAM. He's also the Executive Vice President for Foundation for Drug Policy Solutions, and he founded a Colorado-based national drug policy organization called Protect Our Kids. You've probably seen him on a lot of national media, and I'm happy now to have him on the show today. Luke, thank you so much for joining us.
Deborah, thanks for having me on. I've actually been really looking forward to finally getting on your show, and just appreciate the good work you've done for a number of years.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Well, we'll have to make sure that this is the first of many times we'll have you on my show, which is at 3 o'clock weekdays. Luke, thank you so much. I'm surprised we actually have never gotten connected before, because, we've got so many mutual friends working a lot in the same arena. But I appreciate what you do. And it was actually another mom who connected me with you as we were talking about these issues. So, Luke, let's just start out. The 4 pillars of SAM, which is Smart Approaches to Marijuana, are awareness, reform, prevention, and research, which I think are great. No matter where anybody falls on the legalization of marijuana, those are all good things. Let's talk with awareness, because I think the number one thing that people don't realize is this is really not your mother, your father, your uncle's marijuana. It is very different than it was in the 70s and even the 90s. Can you talk about that first so we can frame this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So and awareness is important, particularly in a state like ours, like Colorado, where I was raised, went to high school, University of Denver, et cetera, for undergrad. We need to have awareness about the basic reality and facts of what today's marijuana is before we have any further discussions about policy on it. And what I'll tell you is there's an industry out there pumping millions of dollars into stuff that's just not based in reality, that this drug is harmless, no big deal, not addictive, all the things that we've heard about it. And that's just not what the science and what the reality shows us. So, when we voted on marijuana in 2012 here in Colorado, the average potency of marijuana was 2 to 3% THC. I mean, you would have been lucky to find anything above 10% THC in a joint. And so THC is the ingredient that gets you high. Now we're talking about a substance that, since we legalized it, the industry has radically changed and altered it. So 2 big things have changed. First of all, it's gone from 3% on average to 60% on average potency. So it's a totally different drug. Yeah, and we're looking at shatters and concentrates that are up to 99% potent. So whatever you thought about marijuana as a joint in the Woodstock days, that's out the window. It is a totally different drug now. The second big thing that's changed since we legalized it is with this new high-potency marijuana has come a strong link between high-potency weed and mental illness, psychosis, schizophrenia. So the largest and most formidable journal on these issues is called the Lancet Journal of Psychiatry. It's a globally, published journal. They're sterling. They just put out 2 research studies in the last 3 years looking at today's new high-potency marijuana. And they found that if you're a regular user of that new weed, you are more than 5 times more likely to develop schizophrenia or psychosis. So this is a link now that they're starting, scientists don't want to say anything causes anything. They'll say, it's related, but they won't say it's a causal link. Mm-hmm. But now the research is getting so strong, so many different studies looking at this new high-potency marijuana, that they're literally saying that high-potency marijuana causes psychosis and schizophrenia. So it's getting to be a real problem. Mm-hmm. And, here in Colorado, we had more than 15,000 hospital visits just last year with marijuana-related diagnosis codes, most of them psychosis, psychotic breaks,
wow.
All kinds of new issues coming from marijuana. So this is not just kind of a, we're not talking about reefer madness here anymore. This is science. This is what we're seeing in our hospitals right now.
Yeah.
And you ask parents, and they'll tell you the same thing, which I think is what you're alluding to.
Well, it is without a doubt. I mean, being a parent today is pretty frightening. I mean, with fentanyl, everybody that's taking all the headlines, and as well it should. But we need to talk about both of these. But I mean, I literally have to tell our kids, don't even pick up something off the ground because it might have fentanyl on it, because that's what people have been doing, and don't take any kind of medication because it's now formed to look like a Percocet or something else like that. But we don't talk enough about marijuana. And just to repeat this, as you're tuning in, Deborah Flora sitting in for George Brauchler, my guest, Luke Niforatos, and he just shared that when Colorado legalized marijuana in 2012, the THC potency was 2 to 3%. Now, on average, it is 60%, up to as high as 99%. I mean, that is something I think most people have no idea about. And, we're talking about this situation with youth. Obviously, in 2012, the law that was passed, it's not supposed to be for kids. And yet everyone knows teenagers, you tell them something and, that just like alcohol is not for kids, a lot of kids drink, not condoning it, but it's just the reality. What are the facts about the increase of young people using marijuana, 12 to 17 years old, let's say, here in Colorado?
Yeah, and so just to highlight what you said, I really appreciate what you said about alcohol, because, you'll hear from the marijuana industry people in this state all the time. They'll say, well, it's illegal for anyone under 21, and so, everything's safer. And this is what they go around the country promising, is, this is for adults, not for kids. And I just kind of look around and say, I went to public high school here in Colorado, and we literally had a designated section for kids to use drugs that were illegal for them. Alcohol, tobacco, right across the street from my high school. I won't name it because I don't want to shame them. But it's just, so kids clearly get into things that are not supposed to be for kids under 21. So let's just deal with reality here.
Right.
And that's why I had a concern with legalization, because I knew legalization would expand access for kids, because it makes these products more prevalent. Theme. And so that message is being heard loud and clear by our kids. Let's look at the national data. So for Colorado, we're the number 3 state in the country for the youth rate of marijuana use.
Wow.
We are number 3. And even that, a number of other states nearby are half to a third of what our rates are. Kansas, Wyoming, Utah. And if you look at those states, they don't have a lot of legal marijuana in any of those states. So it's very clear the policy decision we made here is having an impact on our kids. And not only that, but we're also seeing marijuana exposures for kids under the age of 5. So, very tiny little children, 0 to 5. That has more than tripled over the last few years here. Where they're ingesting marijuana edibles like gummy bears, for example, which by the way, a whole other thing. This is supposedly not for kids, and yet the industry here in Colorado is actively marketing Girl Scouts flavors for their pot, and all kinds of edibles that are appealing to kids. So I don't understand how that's still legal here.
Right,
but that's a whole other issue. But we wonder why these rates are rising. For youth use here, it's because we have a very prolific industry not being regulated effectively, and they're allowed to target kids.
Yeah, some of those statistics, I encourage everyone to go to your website, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, because the statistics in there, unfortunately, Colorado is used as a case study because we legalized it in 2012. One of the ones that jumped out at me is calls to poison control centers for children from 0 to 5. 586% increase since it was legalized. nearly 600% increase in calls to the poison center. When our kids were little, I remember we had that poison control up there on our refrigerator so babysitters could see it and whatever. But it's always like, oh my goodness, they ingested some cleaning solution. But like you said, when it is targeted, it is in the form of gummy bears. I mean, that's startling. And I think one of the other things you were talking about, the psychosis, that what I was reading, one of the statistics, legalization is associated with a 25% increase in marijuana use disorder amongst 12 to 17-year-olds. We have to look at the reality like you're talking about, Luke. I mean, we can argue left and right about, CBD and cannabis and for adults, but this is what happens. This is what's going on. And like you said, public schools. I went to Overland High School. In the Cherry Creek School District. Oh, you're kidding. Well, there you go. Later,
Trailblazers Unite.
There you go. We'll later do the secret Trailblazer handshake. But even when I was there, which I think was long before you, even then, before it was legalized, there were so many people that were smoking marijuana. But at that time, like you said, it was 2 to 3% before it was legalized, THC. Now it's up to 60 to 99%. One other thing, by the way, I want to ask you about. I had retired Major General Jack Briggs on the show last week on my show. And by the way, if you're tuning in, this is Deborah Flora sitting in for my colleague George Brauchler, heard weekdays 3 to 4 p.m. But Jack Briggs runs the Springs Rescue Mission. He said something else that's going on with marijuana is they actually are removing the CBD, which is what most people like, gives you that kind of smooth feeling. And they're increasing the THC, which is the psychotropic part of it, which is bizarre. So they're doing all this kind of jerry-rigging with it. Is there any oversight now that is legal, like with the FDA or anything like that, that actually oversees what is in this product?
Yeah, so that's basically the short answer is no. This is a product that's still federally illegal, to sell, promote, use, all that nationwide. And so, Colorado, among some other states, have chosen to, do this at the state level. So really what we have is a product that's being, supposedly regulated by the MED, and our state agencies here in Colorado. But to be frank, we're a small state government. We are nowhere near capable of regulating an industry that's now up to $40 billion in market cap nationally.
Wow.
This is an industry that knows a lot more about their products and substances, which, by the way, it's so new. They're inventing these products for the first time, every year. And these regulators are just trying to kind of keep up to speed. And also there's just not nearly enough manpower to do it. So,
right.
I would tell you that there's just not a great level of regulation going on. We tried to deal with that, working with a large coalition of partners about 3 years ago, passing Bill 1317, which was here in Colorado's legislature to deal with regulating high-potency marijuana. And so there was, we set up a regulatory commission and all that stuff. They were supposed to look at potency and then, propose regulations. Well, unfortunately, Governor Polis is the most pro-pot governor in the entire country. And
quite a
and
moniker.
So he did a favor for his marijuana buddies, and he shut down the commission's regulations essentially behind the scenes. And so
wow.
they released something that was not even close to useful or in the spirit of the text. So we got to keep fighting the industry. And that's another reason why, by the way, why my organization advocates against legalization is because when you create this industry, they hire up all the best and brightest lobbyists. Mm-hmm. They get into all the circles in the politics, and then they shut down attempts to regulate. And, this isn't the first time we've seen that playbook. Obviously, Big Tobacco does that. Big Pharma does that. They're able to kind of get the best and brightest and shut down regulation. So that's something we have to be cognizant of because dollars and cents and corruption will always outweigh public health and our kids. And that's why parents, moms, I have 2 little girls, we have to stand up and fight for our kids and make sure politicians listen to our voices over the well-moneyed interests of the best lobbying groups in Colorado, for example, which is exactly what's happening.
Well, and that's the thing, even for those who are listening, or those in Colorado that are for marijuana legalization, when you think about it, even on alcohol, you see what the percentage is, what the alcohol percentage is in any kind of beverage you're going to imbibe. I mean, it's there. It is so that the consumer can know. I mean, for those who are, who are marijuana users, I think they have a right to know whether what they are taking has 60% THC or 99% THC or, what it used to be, 2 to 3%, which probably is not even available anymore. And I think that the awareness thing is so important. I'm old enough to remember the campaign where they would show just even the old marijuana with 2 to 3% THC in it, and they'd have somebody sitting in the basement, these two guys, and they say, yeah, they told me if I was, smoking marijuana, nothing would happen, and then the mom yells from upstairs and says, take out the trash, and then the subtitle is, that's right, nothing happens. Even then, there was an awareness of, what the impact might be. There's no awareness at all. And I'm hearing from so many parents who are so afraid because of these psychotic breaks that are happening with young people who are much more prone to it. Before I let you go, because we're going to head to a break, and I'm going to definitely have you back on my show as well. One of your organizations is Protect Our Kids. It is a Colorado-based national drug policy organization. What are the solutions? What can we do? Those people who are listening, what can we do about this?
Yeah, so the first thing is we got us and our coalition of folks here all in Colorado, lots of different organizations. We got HB 1317 passed on high potency marijuana off the strength of parents coming to Denver and testifying, and we had dozens and dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of parents coming and sharing what happened to their kids. And so now is the time to speak up. It's a very personal subject. It's very hard. My nearby neighbor, Laura Stack, she is somebody who, her son, Johnny Stack, he died by suicide after using high-potency marijuana. He was only 15 years old. But she came and shared her story, and that was critical. And so taking that step of faith and sharing the stories of what's happening to your family is important, because then everyone across Colorado hears that, they're emboldened, they come out and share their kids' stories. That is the most important thing right now, is to tell the truth about what's happening over the industry's lies. And then the second thing is we've got to start, drawing a line in the sand here in our state about how many drugs we're going to legalize. My organization, Protect Our Kids, we led the fight last year against legalizing psychedelics for quote-unquote medical purposes, and that's just rolling out now, and we'll see what the impact is going to be. But we have to draw the line in the sand here in our state and say we're going to cut off all the drug legalization going on, because it's not helping homelessness, it's not helping crime, it's not making our state a better place to live. And so we need to do something about this. We need to start pushing back on industries trying to make money off of dealing drugs around our state. So I think that's something we need to have a statewide conversation about as well.
Yeah, indeed. We have regulation over everything else that we put into our body for the most part. Regulation over food, the FDA. And like you said, because this is not federally legal, the FDA is not engaged. But it's really important to get this word out. And boy, if you're a parent or a grandparent listening, share these facts with your kids and your grandkids. Just this one fact alone. THC levels when marijuana was legalized in 2012 in Colorado was approximately 2 to 3%, THC being the active drug component. Now, on average, 60% up to 99%. So that's why there is this fallout happening. And I appreciate what you shared about the Lancet Journal. This is medically provable. So, Luke, why don't you share again for listeners where they can find out more and be armed with the facts so they can protect their families and have good conversations with those neighbors around them?
Absolutely. So our website for SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, is learnaboutsam.org. Learnaboutsam.org. And then my organization, Protect Our Kids, is protectourkids.info. You can check out what we're doing as well there. Love to connect with you. You can contact me from our website. Would love to network further. And obviously I'm on Twitter as well with Luke Niforatos.
Great. Thank you. Well, Luke, I did not even know you were a fellow Overland Trailblazer. So look at those connections that we have.
I know. It was truly a God thing. I'm looking forward to getting to know you better, Deborah. Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
You as well. And thank you for what you're doing for the kids in this state and around the country. Thank you so much. And Luke, definitely will continue this conversation on my show as well. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. God bless.
God bless you too. Bye-bye. Well, that was Luke Niforatos, He is the Executive Vice President of Smart Approaches to Marijuana, SAM. You can go to learnaboutsam.org later today. I will share that on my social media, so you can go there, and that is at Deb Flora Show on Facebook, The Deborah Flora Show, and Twitter at Deborah Flora 1. When we come back, we're going to open up the phone lines. 303-696-1971, 303-696-1971. Let me ask you this question. Are you having second thoughts about legalizing marijuana here in Colorado? I got to tell you, as a parent, I don't like what I'm seeing, to say the least. That's kind of where I come down on this. But I don't know if we can put that genie back in the bottle, but we sure can educate people. I want to hear from you. 303-696-1971. You can also text for the free 710 KNUS app. Don't go anywhere. I'm Deborah Flora, News Talk 710 KNUS. Welcome back to The George Show. I'm Deborah Flora, sitting in for my colleague George Brauchler. You can hear my show Monday through Friday, 3 to 4 p.m. Having some great conversations this morning. Really appreciate hearing from the listeners through texts and calls. And we're talking about what's going on with marijuana since it was legalized in 2012. And I appreciate the dialogue about this. One listener, and this is jumping off of the conversation we just had with Luke Niforatos. He is Executive Vice President of Smart Approaches to Marijuana, SAM. And he was sharing some information that I think everyone who is, pro-marijuana should also be able to know this information, that the Lancet Journal has been studying this and reporting that in 2012, when marijuana was legalized, it was 2 to 3% THC potency on average. Now the average potency is 60%, sometimes as high as 99%. So I posed the question before we went to break, what do people think? Are they having second thoughts about legalization? And I had a listener text in. This was a very good conversation. They said, why don't you talk about the dangers of alcohol? It's way worse than weed, way worse. Well, that brings up an interesting point, because when there was, for instance, drunk driving, there was an organization, MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, who really took a strong stand. Now, their stand was not outlaw alcohol, go back to prohibition. That wasn't their stand. Their stand was education about what's going on. And it's interesting to note that since marijuana was legalized, car accidents, fatal car accidents, not just car accidents, fatal car accidents involving marijuana use has doubled. It's gone up, 200%. It's doubled from 2013 to 2020. So whether you're for it or against it, there is a huge need to have a conversation about getting the word out. So the conversation with the listener went on, and I talked about how now with marijuana having that high potency, it is more dangerous than alcohol, at least from the standpoint that it's not labeled. You go into a liquor store and you can see what percentage alcohol there is in everything. No matter what, consumers have a right to know. So, and then the listener brought up the point that in dispensaries they are, I'll take their word for it. Can't say that I've been in one, but in dispensaries they are, which is great. The challenge is this. Most children who are getting their hands on it don't go to a dispensary because by law they can't buy there. So they're getting it off the street. The most important thing about this conversation is awareness. That's the most important thing. And I do believe that if we're going to have this substance that is legalized, there should be some sort of regulation. There should be some saying, okay, you have to let everyone know what's in it. The other fact that we did not get to when we were talking with Luke is that part of the arguments for the legalization was, okay, the tax dollars will go to all of these things. When you legalize it, then it can be regulated. And that's all great. But everywhere it's been legalized, the black market has also boomed for the very fact that there are going to be people that don't want to go through a system. So we got to figure out how to do that. If we're going to have this in our country, in our state, then we need to have, as Luke talks about, smart approaches to marijuana. And I got to tell you, this has become more and more something I am hearing about. When you look at this statistic, calls to poison control centers for children 0 to 5 years old, think about that, who've ingested marijuana in some form because it comes in gummy bears and whatever now, 586% increase in those calls, nearly doubled how many hospitalizations there are. Everyone has a right to know, and I think that is something that we need to talk about. So that's really the point about that. It's about information. I kind of put in the same category of, if we're going to have abortion up until the moment of birth in Colorado, which we do, it's interesting that those who are pushing it, and no, I'm not equating that with marijuana use, but I am equating it with, if we legalize something, people have a right to know. They have a right to be protected. There were amendments to that were brought by Republican lawmakers under the dome. And there was even one that just simply said, okay, if this is going to be the case, then mandate sterilized instruments and mandate some kind of oversight of these clinics. And that was even repudiated. It was defeated by the Democrats pushing this. So it's a good conversation to have. Most of all, if you've got young people in your life, it is a good conversation to have with them, because the adolescent brain is developing from about 12 years old. Before that, it's the childhood brain, but the adolescent brain is developing from about 12 years old up until late 20s, early 30s, depending on who you talk to. And it is most impactful on those people that are in that category. I want to switch gears here, although if you want to continue that conversation, feel free to call in at 303-696-1971. Appreciate all the texters who are texting in about this. We have been talking about censorship and free speech, and I realize we are about to head to a break, but when we come back, what I want to talk about is the good news. I am seeing seismic shifts in our culture of people who are no longer allowing the elite media, the elite politicians to tell them what they should be watching, what they should be believing. And when we come back, I'm going to have a story about the movie Sound of Freedom, which just went over $100 million. Some of you listen to the show know that while I grew up here in Colorado, and just found out from Luke that we both went to Overland High School in the Cherry Creek School District in Aurora. I had temporary insanity, went to Hollywood. I'm a recovered actress in my left brain, my right mind. My husband was a producer at Disney. We have our own film company. And so when we come back, I'm going to share some eye-popping statistics about how Sound of Freedom is setting industry records at a time where the leftist media is trying to shut it down. You know, whenever I think, what I'm beginning to see is anytime there is this vitriolic and conservative an effort to shut something down by the woke leftist media, it's got to be doing something right. When we come back, we'll talk about that. I also want to hear from you if you have seen Sound of Freedom. 303-696-1971. 303-696-1971. You can also text in through the free 710 KNUS app. Don't go anywhere. I'm Deborah Flora, News Talk 710 KNUS.
Want to take your favorite radio station wherever you go? Well, now there's an app for that. No matter where you are, stream your favorite shows. Tap the app to listen to podcasts. Talk back to your favorite local hosts.
At the tone, leave a message.
Call the show. Set your alarm. Enter contests and win prizes, all in the palm of your hand. Available now for iOS and Android devices in the App Store or Google Play. And best of all, it's free. Download today.
Welcome back to The George Show. I'm Deborah Flora, sitting in for my colleague George Brauchler. We've been having a great conversation about marijuana, about the potency, about all of that, and what we can do to protect our kids, because it is really hitting that most of all. I posed the question, do you regret legalizing it? I've been hearing from both sides, which has been a good conversation. One listener was wholeheartedly still in support of it. Another listener just texted and said, I voted for pot, and yes, wish I didn't. It was just as easy to get it off the black market, and the state wouldn't have attracted these basically quoting the listener, stupid liberal hippies. Well, that is a valid viewpoint. The reality is the black market is still burgeoning, and actually in many ways more so. The biggest thing I think is that we have to have an information campaign, because the reality is that young people who do not get it through dispensaries, who get it off the street, it is incredibly dangerous. And there's growing cases of young people who are literally having psychotic breaks with the potency of off the street marijuana, and not even adding to that a lot of it now is laced with other things, other psychotropic drugs, and fentanyl. Monday on my show, which is Monday through Friday at 3 p.m., I'm going to have a wonderful guest who has a very challenging story, and that's Andrea Thomas. She, in the wake of her daughter's tragic death with fentanyl poisoning, it's really poisoning. She thought she was taking, I believe it was a Percocet, and it ended up being fentanyl, and died. She has started an organization called Facing Fentanyl, so we can talk about how we can end this scourge of fentanyl in our society and in our culture. And the reality is anything off the streets can be laced with it. One drop is enough to kill anyone. So we just have to have awareness, especially with our kids. The other topic we've been talking about this show is free speech and how important it is. And I want to give you something I'm very encouraged by. That's one of the things on my show that we always try to talk about is the encouraging news, because encouraging literally means putting courage into. And when we share some of these stories, it is encouraging. It gives us more courage. One of those is the leftist attempt to discredit the movie Sound of Freedom. Sound of Freedom, as many of you know, is a movie starring Jim Caviezel. It talks about the real-life heroism of Homeland Security Special Agent Tim Ballard. And Tim Ballard, who was lauded by all of the media just a few years ago, CNN, MSNBC, you name it, they were lauding him as a hero for what he did, which was exposing through his organization Operation Underground Railroad that child trafficking and sex trafficking that was going on in South America. And now, for some reason, they're working to discredit it, throwing out all of these weird accusations that has something to do with QAnon. Well, the history of this movie is just as interesting. We're friends with the director Alejandro Monteverde, who did Bella, and a new movie coming out called Cabrini. The producer Eduardo de Verastegui, they had their pro-life movie came out the same time that my husband and I made a short film, kind of like a Twilight Zone episode exposing partial birth abortion. But this movie, Sound of Freedom, actually wrapped in 2018. It's been sitting on a shelf. And I got to talk with Alejandro, the director, last week about how the timing is perfect. He and I both share the faith that God has a timing to certain things. And the timing of this movie coming out now is perfect, because there's conversations about all kinds of terrible things happening in our culture that are being heightened now. But what's interesting about the history of the movie, it was bought by the Walt Disney Company in 2019, and they sat on it. They did not release it. And then the producer, Eduardo and Jim Caviezel, went to them and asked if they could buy it back, and they did. And ironically, people are voting with their dollars, and this movie has now cleared $100 million with a budget of $14.5 million. And Disney has lost $900 million in their last few releases. So people are voting with their dollars. They're not listening to the mainstream media trying to silence these movies. And by the way, anyone who wants to silence a story exposing child trafficking, you have to know there is something wrong. I mean, that is one area we should all be able to stand in agreement on. I want to continue with this conversation, but also we've got a caller on the line. Louis from Arvada, you are on the George Show with Deborah Flora.
Hello there. How are you?
I'm good. How are you this morning?
Good. I was just telling the gentleman who answered the phone. I'm 68. When we were young and needed alcohol, we just had somebody buy it, who was legal, and we just paid them extra money to do it. And if anybody thinks that you can buy an ounce of marijuana every day, and some people do, if they're smoking one joint every hour, 20 grams, and they're buying it every day, they're doing something else besides smoking that. And they're selling it. So we just made more drug dealers is all we did.
Right.
I don't know why nobody understands that when there's money to be made, you can buy an ounce of pot, I bet, for $140, and at $10 a joint, 28 joints a gram, you make $140. You're doubling your money, and you're able to buy it every day an ounce.
Yeah. Well, and no, go ahead. So, sorry, Lou. What else did you want to add?
No, I'm good with that.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's interesting is when you legalize something without an accompanying awareness campaign, you see exactly what's going on. What was communicated to young people is this is just fine. It's just great.
Yeah.
But they get it then from black market drug dealers with such high potency. We're seeing devastating effects. And I'm wondering, where is the accompanying messaging campaign to let people know what is happening? And you're go ahead. Yes.
But a lot of them people selling high potency marijuana are buying it from dispensaries and making money off it. They're not growing it all the time. They're buying it legally and then making money by reselling it. And if anybody thinks I'm wrong, they're crazy. I mean, like I said, we got alcohol when we were young. We just paid the guy $10 more for a case.
Right.
Here.
Right.
And it happened all the time, And so if anybody thinks that people ain't buying it in a dispensary and go selling it illegally to children or people underage, I think they're wrong.
Well, and I think the fact is we have to deal with the reality of what's happening, not the hypothetical of what was promised. And the reality of what's happening is the use among young people has skyrocketed. And then the access for children has led to, I was talking about the statistic, a nearly 600% increase of folks who are calling the poison hotline for children 0 to 5. Thanks, Louis, for calling in. Boy, this hour went fast. Thank you so much. We're heading to the break. When we come back, we're going to talk about another big Supreme Court win with the person who is behind it. Don't go anywhere. I'm Deborah Flora, News Talk 710 KNUS. Welcome to The George Show. I am Deborah Flora, sitting in for my colleague George Brauchler. So happy to be with you today. Boy, this morning has gone fast. My show is heard Monday through Friday, 3 to 4 p.m. That goes fast, but I'm surprised we're already on the fourth hour of the program. Enjoying every minute of it. Thank you for taking your time to start off this day by listening to 710 KNUS. We so appreciate it. And we've been having a great conversation today. If you missed any of the show, please do go to the website, 710knus.com, and you can hear all of the previous conversations. You can also hear my shows. For instance, yesterday I had Lori Smith of 303 Creative on talking about the big win in the Supreme Court for free speech and against government-compelled speech, and also the cost of taking a courageous stand, because she has literally been receiving death threats. Her family has been threatened. She doesn't even let her daughter play in the front yard anymore. That's the cost. But courage is contagious. So that's why we share these stories, so we all can stand up. Well, another courageous woman I'm so happy to have joining me is another person that is behind one of the big wins in the Supreme Court, and that is Elaine Parker. She's the president of Job Creators Network Foundation, and they were one of the organizations that brought a suit against Joe Biden's unconstitutional school loan debt redistribution scheme. I know that's not what he calls it, but that's what it really is. And theirs was the case that stopped it initially, so then another plaintiff could win that case in the Supreme Court. Elaine, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Deborah.
Absolutely. Well, I've had you on the on my show different times throughout this case, and I wanted to share with you that last week I was with one of the attorneys that argued against this overreach of the executive branch in the Supreme Court, and he was speaking so highly of you and the lawsuit that you all brought that it literally stopped it long enough with the Texas judge so that it could then be permanently stopped in the Supreme Court. So appreciate what you have done. Let's talk a little bit about what is going on now, because when you and I spoke right after the ruling, there were rumblings of the Biden administration not listening to this rebuke of this overreach of the executive branch and saying that he was going to go ahead anyway, saying things like, we can't let this stand, this can't be the last word, which I'm not sure what he thinks, about the checks and balances of our system. But they are now proceeding to try this again. So let's talk about that, because the previous one was ruled unconstitutional, that it's not the role of the executive branch to handle the purse strings and forgive $400 billion worth of debt. Now they want to do $39 billion. Can you talk about what's going on?
Yeah, it's like whack-a-mole right now, Deborah.
Boy, isn't that kind of summarizes it, doesn't it? It keeps popping up in different areas.
Yeah, they're coming at it from as many directions as they can, hoping something sticks. And that's right. It's exactly 3 weeks ago that the Supreme Court knocked down this illegal government overreach by the Biden administration. And if you had a chance to read Justice Roberts' opinion that he wrote, he called the cost of this plan staggering at $400 billion. But there's more. Instead of respecting the Supreme Court's decision, President Biden and his administration is basically giving the Supreme Court the middle finger, because they're working on these workarounds and basically acting like a king. I mean, there's no other way to describe it.
Right.
The Supreme Court said, you can't do this. You can't spend this kind of money with taxpayer dollars without input from Congress. Mm-hmm. And he basically said, I don't like your answer, so I'm going to go back to the drawing board. And he's come up with a couple of workarounds. And we knew that there was a plan B in the works. We didn't know all of the details. There were some things coming out about the income-driven repayment plans. We've got much more clear idea of what they're planning to do now. And, it's kind of a three-pronged approach.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I guess is the best way to describe it.
Three moles we need to whack back down again right now, and whack-a-mole, right?
Exactly. The administration announced on last week that they plan to forgive almost $40 billion in student loans for about 804,000 people. Mm-hmm. Now, this amounts to nothing more than vote buying.
Right.
And now we know what a vote costs. It's about 40 billion divided by 800,000. What's that, about $50,000 a vote? That this prong is merely an administrative fix, but really it's just to implement a student loan forgiveness workaround. And what they're going to do is they're going to forgive this $40 billion by more accurately counting the qualifying payments made under these income-driven plans. That should have moved borrowers closer. So basically what they're going to do is they're going to count payments that were never made while their loans were in forbearance or deferment or were only partially made. So you could have made 0 payments, as many people did over the last 3 years, and those payments are going to count.
Wow. Well, and right there, you just summed it up with a nonsensical, not your statement, but what they're saying. They're going to count payments that weren't made. I mean, it's right there. It's just pulling it out of the hat. I think one of the main points that I want to get to that you articulate so very well is every single one of us believes that the burden that students are under or graduates are under is wrong. I mean, it is absolutely wrong, the burden they've been put under, but we're not looking at actually fixing the problem with any of these. Like you said, it's basically a $50,000 per person trying to buy their vote for the next election cycle, which is what a lot of people look at what, Biden did, last summer to try and buy a certain, group of people's votes going into the election, knowing it would probably be knocked down and unconstitutional. But nobody that is pushing this is talking about the actual cause and how do we fix the actual cause. So let's talk about that, because a lot of times people can misconstrue our viewpoint as being discompassionate or not compassionate. That's not the case. There is a problem. Student loan debt is a problem, but let's look at the cause. So where is the cause of this actually coming from?
Well, what we've seen over it, and yes, let me be clear. We have always said that we agreed with the Biden administration that we have a crisis. It's
right.
A $1.7 trillion crisis. We just disagree with who should be held accountable. We don't think it should be taxpayers held accountable for this. We've got these universities and colleges that are sitting on $700 billion in endowments.
Wow.
And every year they raise tuition far past the rate of inflation on these students. All the while they pay their presidents $1 million salaries. They have an army of highly paid administrators that is basically bureaucracy on steroids.
Right.
And they build these gold-plated Taj Mahals across campuses that are all on the backs of these students. And on top of that, the federal government took the student loans up to the federal government in 2008 under the Obama-Biden administration and took the banks out of the process. And that kind of kickstarted everything on steroids, because we started seeing all of these degree programs, what I'll call low-value degree programs
yes.
offered to students that don't provide them with marketable skills to get jobs that will pay back these loans.
Right.
So think about it. If you're a small business owner and you're going to a bank and you're saying, I'd like a loan for my small business, the bank says, well, how are you going to pay it back? What's your financial plan to pay us back? These students are being sold a degree program, and there's no checks and balances. I mean, I know it's a little more complicated in how these degree programs are funded, but they're funded by the universities if the banks are involved. The federal government doesn't care. The
right.
spigot is on. It
right.
is an easy flow of money. And so every time the president tries to forgive these loans, it's basically a signal to universities that they can continue increasing costs. And we need to haul them in and ask these colleges, why are you increasing these costs on these students? What is driving up your costs? It's almost like it's a federal jobs program for these colleges and universities to build up their bureaucracy.
Yes.
And we don't think that taxpayers should be accountable for that.
No, I mean, there's so many great things you've unpacked there. We had Rob Natelson, a constitutional expert, on the program at 7 a.m. And he was talking when it came to the Supreme Court ruling. He really wished that the Supreme Court had said, wait a second, the real problem is the government has no business being in the school loan area in the first place. And what I think is interesting is when you've described this before, it became so apparent, this circular situation that happens in big government. You know, the Obama administration, Joe Biden as vice president, really caused the problem by federalizing the student loans. Like you said, then wrote a blank check on the back of taxpayers because, as you said, banks look at, is this a good loan or not? If the government just knows they're spending everybody else's money, they don't care. So it was under the Biden administration. And then what happened, on the Obama administration, and then now Biden comes in and forgives it. It's really this kind of self-serving circular situation with students being the victim. And I think that's a huge point. And to your other point, I mean, we've got a son that's going to college right now. When we were looking at this, one of the things we love about the school that he's going to, one of the most important statistics for us was within 6 months, they have a 98 to 100% job placement. That's important because it's an investment versus, sending your child to a school and wondering why they can't get a job with a degree that's basically Renaissance period gender studies and basket weaving. I mean, it doesn't have anything. So what is the solution here? And by the way, if you're just tuning in, Deborah Flora sitting in for my colleague George Brauchler. My guest is Elaine Parker. She is the president of Job Creators Network Foundation, helped lead the fight against the student loan debt redistribution scheme. What is the solution to this, to this problem we have, this school loan debt crisis, which is a very real one?
Well, there's a lot of ideas out there, but what I'm really happy to see is just a few weeks ago, Senate Republicans and even House Republicans have introduced legislation that aims to bring greater transparency to the student loan lending program. It brings accountability and success measurements, what you just talked about, into these degree programs. And it's not saying if you're a student and you want to go for one of those degrees you mentioned, Renaissance studies and things like that, you can. But it just means that if the job available with that kind of degree program doesn't provide the salary to pay back the loan, you're not going to get a student loan on it. You're welcome to pay for it yourself and get that degree program, but you're not going to get a federal loan to support that and then not be able to get a job to pay it back. And so these success measurements are very important. And I actually believe that we would see the free market kick in under a success measure prospect if we saw legislation like that, because if students couldn't get loans to pay for low value degrees, they would go away.
Right.
The colleges wouldn't offer them anymore. They would start offering more competitive degrees. And here's what we know. We know that Purdue University just announced its 12th year in a row of tuition freeze.
Wow.
So the president of the college is former Governor Mitch Daniels. If he can do it for 12 years, every single person in the Biden administration and the Department of Education should be sitting down with him and asking him, how did you do it? How can we replicate that with other colleges and universities across the country? And we should hold hearings on it. We should bring in the top, presidents of the top 20 offenders of college tuition price gouging, I call it, bring in Mitch Daniels and have them testify before Congress. I mean, again, let me remind your listeners, this is a $1.7 trillion crisis.
Right.
Why not bring them in the way they brought in, the CEOs of banks during the financial meltdown and the heads of the auto companies when they wanted a bailout? I mean, this is essentially bailing these colleges out, because if this forgiveness, whatever form it goes in, goes through, it is just a blank check to those colleges and universities to keep raising tuition.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, that would be the thing. If they want to actually solve the problem, that is what they would do. They would bring in schools that are succeeding at this and ask them how they're doing it. But to your point at the very beginning, really what it seems like this is another ploy, not really to get to the heart of the problem, which started under the Obama administration when they federalized the school loans, and now Biden is trying to bail them out so they can continue to do it. This is really, it seems like a politically motivated way to try and buy votes, and it's just not helpful. I also think, by the way, it's going to lead to, and I'm having conversations with a lot of parents who have kids the same age going into college, a reexamination of college itself. I mean, college is necessary, but not necessarily for everyone. And if you're going just to have 4 years to party and to get a degree, as you said, which is a low value degree, there's not actually a job for it, then that's not a purpose to get into this kind of level of debt. So I think it's an opportunity if we seize the moment. And let me ask you this. What is next now that Biden is, as you said, basically giving the finger to the Supreme Court, saying, no, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to do $39 billion here and 2 other places. Is this all going to head to lawsuits again?
I think we will see litigation. The big hurdle to overcome, as the previous plan that they put forward, is going to be standing. Fortunately, the AGs in the case that the Supreme Court upheld 3 weeks ago, they've proven standing. So there is an opportunity, obviously, for them to evaluate whether or not they can bring litigation again. But that's the big hurdle to overcome for everyone, is standing, because when you get to the merits of the case, the executive branch is a co-equal branch of the government. He's not a king. He doesn't have the authority to spend this kind of taxpayer dollars without congressional authority.
Yeah, I wish that every single citizen could be considered to have standing, because the reality is this is an overreach of the executive branch. The purse strings are handled by the House of Representatives. And for every single person that worked diligently to pay off their student loan debt, or for those going into college who are about to be built and burdened with huge loan debt with low value degrees, there are so many people that truly have standing, but I understand it's a much more fine point when it comes to the Supreme Court. Well, Elaine, thank you. We're going to keep an eye on how you're playing whack-a-mole on all of these things and have you back on this show because it keeps popping up. Appreciate it. Why don't you share with listeners, by the way, where they can find out more about Job Creators Network Foundation?
They can go to jobcreatorsnetworkfoundation.org, or they can look at our sister organization, advocacy, which is jobcreatorsnetwork.com.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much for what you do. Thanks for taking the time to be on the show this morning. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, that was my guest, Elaine Parker. She's the president of Job Creators Network Foundation. They were the organization that brought the first lawsuit against the student loan redistribution scheme, student loan debt redistribution. And that's really what it is. It's redistributing the debt that was taken on by individuals to those who didn't accrue that debt. And it's, as Elaine was saying, it is a problem because there's $1.7 trillion of school loan debt out there. But it always has to come back to this. Who is to blame for that? Who is responsible for that, and what is actually the solution? The solution is not to give the colleges carte blanche to continue with these policies. And hey, I'm a big college football fan. I mean, I married into the Ohio State Buckeyes. But when the average, or at least a quite frequent income of college coaches is $10 million, you know things have gotten out of whack. College presidents make millions of dollars, and poor students graduate frequently burdened with debt without a degree. So here's my question for you as we head into the break, and we'll open up the phone lines, 303-696-1971, 303-696-1971. Do you think a college degree is worth it anymore? That's really the bottom line. Of course, if you're a doctor, I do hope you get a degree. I do not want you doing brain surgery on anyone I care about without proper education and training. But generally, do you think it is time to re-examine college itself? That's a conversation we'll have when we come back. I think in many cases it is. Don't go anywhere. I'm Deborah Flora, sitting in for George Brauchler on News Talk 710 KNUS.
Imagine the lifelong impact of a journey to the Holy Land, surrounded by like-minded travelers. Picture yourself stepping foot in iconic locations right out of history. With nationally syndicated radio hosts Dennis Prager and Mike Gallagher, you'll gain firsthand understanding of the spiritual and political importance of this vital region.
Hi, it's Mike Gallagher here. I hope you'll join Dennis Prager and me on an amazing journey through Israel in October 2023.
Discover Israel's vibrant culture and why this nation is such a strategic partner for the United States. Join Dennis Prager and Mike Gallagher on this life-enriching Israel tour, October 25th through November 3rd, 2023. For more information, call 855-565-5519 or visit standwithisraeltour.com.
Welcome back to The George Show. I'm Deborah Flora, sitting in for my colleague George Brauchler this morning. Cannot believe we are winding up the final hour. It has gone so quickly. So appreciate the great input from so many of you wonderful 710 KNUS listeners. We were just talking about the issue with school loan debt. We had Elaine Parker on the show. She is the president of Job Creators Network Foundation, the organization that sued to stop the Biden school loan debt redistribution scheme, and they succeeded in stopping it in the Texas in the court there, and then it went to the Supreme Court with another plaintiff and was overturned. But that's not stopping the Biden administration. She was sharing how there's a $1.7 trillion crisis going on, because that's how much school loan debt there is. And the real responsibility lies with the colleges that have been increasing tuition with a blank check and putting it on the backs of students. So I asked this question before the break. Do you think it's time to re-examine college? I certainly think that, by the way, if you're going to be a lawyer, a doctor, if you are going to be an engineer, yes, for heaven's sake, please get a good degree. But it's time to re-examine other opportunities. And one listener just chimed in using the free 710 KNUS app and said, college is trash. Trades. People need to do trades. I can see kids going to community college to learn how to read, write, and do math because public schools don't teach that anymore. But trades, man. And I agree. One of my favorite guests I've had on my show, which is heard Monday through Friday at 3 o'clock, is John Ratzenberger. Many people know him as Cliff Clavin from Cheers. He had a show called Made in America, the voice of most Pixar movies until they got so woke that they cut him out. But he really has been an advocate for trades. He was actually been on the Presidential Council for Apprenticeship. And I think it is time to re-examine it to a certain extent. He would often go and talk to students and say, by the way, if there's someone sitting here right now who's going to be, let's say, a mechanic or a welder, they're going to be entering into their field, especially in welding, at about $70,000 a year. They're going to be able to have a car and a boat, and other people are going to have to come to them to get the work done. I do think there's a place for college, but only degrees where there is an actual job for it. Otherwise, we're just feeding a woke machine. Well, also I started off the first hour of the show talking about free speech, how important that is, especially in the day and age of so much censorship, so much of the woke mob trying to bully other people into silence. A couple quotes that I shared that I think are so telling is from the very beginning of our founding. George Washington said, if freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter. George Orwell, in his very prescient book, 1984, probably should have been called 2024, he said, in a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Well, that's what we do on this station, on my show. We have revolutionary acts of telling the truth. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the dissident in Soviet Russia, who was put in a gulag, said, one man who stopped lying could bring down a tyranny. That's why free speech is so important, why the free airwaves are so important, why we have to have things like 710 KNUS and Salem Radio, so we can come and reason together and not have government-compelled speech or government-censored speech. And that's why I want to take a moment during the segment before we go to the break to have a very special tribute. And that's because one of the co-founders of Salem Media, Stuart Epperson, has passed away. And he truly has a legacy of helping to nourish, nurture, and protect free speech. So before we go to the break, I want you to hear this very special tribute to Stuart Epperson, who has just passed.
Hi, this is Hugh Hewitt. Early this week, Salem Media Group put out a press release announcing the death of the co-founder of the company, Stuart Epperson. Stuart passed at the age of 86 after a battle with leukemia. We saw this day coming, but it came sooner than I and many others expected, and it hurts. Stu Epperson is a legend. What he did, along with his brother-in-law, Ed Atzinger, is not just a great American success story. It is that, but it's a story about a man who leveraged everything, time and again, to build a media company that would make a difference, to build a media company that would be salt and light to a world desperately in need of both. Stu grew up on a tobacco farm in Virginia. He went on to live in North Carolina. He'd been involved with radio since the age of 7, when his brother Ralph built a radio station in their farmhouse in Virginia in 1943. His first radio station came in 1961 in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. It was 1986 when he combined his radio assets with his brother-in-law, Ed Atzinger, to found Salem. In 2005, Time magazine recognized Stu as one of the 25 most influential evangelicals in America. Quote, "It's been a dream life," he said in a 2020 interview. "Yeah, we've had struggles," he continued. "We've had problems, we've had challenges. But God has been there all the time, leading us, guiding us, and he's still doing that today." Stu was always supportive of the growth and expansion of Salem into conservative space, but there was no question about it. Stuart's passion was in Christian media. Stuart's passion was for the gospel. Stu's efforts have had a gospel impact, not limited to his work through Salem. A terrific window into the heart of this man is through another organization he founded, One Kid at a Time. It's a mentoring ministry. He'd make the time to pour into boys who didn't have a dad, well into his later years. He knew that God is a father to the fatherless, and Stu wanted to help. In that 2020 interview I just mentioned, he gave a very clear challenge about what was most important to him.
Seek the Lord while you may be found. Call upon him while he's near. Seek the Lord. Study the Bible. Get serious about it. Don't be a casual believer. Don't be a casual Christian. Be a true blue, sold out to the Lord, and study the Bible. Be a Bible student the rest of your life.
Stuart Epperson's radio and media legacy is still very much alive, through Salem Media, of course, and through his son, Stu Jr., who now serves on the board of Salem. Stu Jr. owns and operates some 50 stations through his own media enterprise, Truth Broadcasting, based in North Carolina. Stu is survived by his wife, Nancy, his 4 children, their spouses, and 24 grandchildren. Stu ran the race, and he ran it very well. We'll miss you, Stu. I'm fully confident that Stu Epperson will be greeted with the words in heaven, "Well done, good and faithful servant."
A beautiful tribute to Stuart Epperson, one of the co-founders of Salem Media. And boy, when he was inspired to help start this important organization, it was for getting the truth out, the truth of the gospel, the truth that is objective truth. And what a legacy, because we're able to come together and talk together today and come and reason together because of the vision of someone like Stuart Epperson. Well, don't go anywhere. When we come back, we're going to wind this show up. I'm so grateful for every single one of you listeners that's helping carry on that incredible legacy started by Stu Epperson as one of the co-founders. Don't go anywhere. I'm Deborah Flora, sitting in for George Brauchler, News Talk 710 KNUS. Okay, good. Okay, good. We'll have him talk. Just let him know he only has like one or 2 minutes. So, okay, awesome. Thank you. Welcome back to The George Show. I'm Deborah Flora, sitting in for my colleague George Brauchler. Winding up the show today. It has gone so quickly. Thanks to you great listeners who've been texting and calling in. So appreciate it. My show is heard Monday through Friday, 3 to 4 p.m. Hey, before I forget, I want to make sure to extend an invitation. Please join us at the Dennis Prager Cigar Night. It's our third annual one every time. It is a wonderful evening with great conversation with like-minded people. Like I say on my show all the time, liberty loves company, and this is a place to find that kind of company. So it's Wednesday night, August 30th at the View House in Centennial. Your ticket will include hors d'oeuvres, a carving station, your first beverage, and of course, premium cigars. It would not be a cigar night without the premium cigars. Seating is limited, however, so please get your tickets and complete details at 710knus.com. Well, we've been talking about many different things today, and before I wind up returning to free speech, I wanted to take a caller because we've been talking about the university system. Is it worth it? The student loan debt crisis is $1.7 trillion on the backs of students, many graduating with what, as Elaine Parker of Job Creators Network Foundation says, are low value degrees, meaning there's no job for them. So they graduate with a degree without a job, and the only people that prosper are the universities that are sitting on $700 billion worth of funds and endowments just sitting there. Well, we're going to take one last caller before we wind up the show. Roger from Aurora, you are on The George Show with Deborah Flora. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. But the university education system is kind of criminal. It starts in K through 12 education, when the goal of K through 12 education is just graduating people. So what happens is people don't know what to do when they get out of K through 12, and they're encouraged to go to college. Colleges are making either ACT or SATs optional now, or they're not even looking for it. So students are entering in college and universities without the skills to succeed.
Yes.
And what happens is people are walking into a campus environment. They're enrolled in remedial classes. When I came to the university many years ago, probably 18 years ago, our writing program was run by a couple students in the library. Now it is a huge department in a whole floor of a building because students can't write.
Yeah.
And people are borrowing money to take classes to get credit, which may or may not be good, not just for math, but also for English and also for writing.
Yeah.
They don't have the skills. And so you're starting a year in debt just to get what you should have had in K through 12 education.
That is such
Then students are encouraged to get their master's. The students are also encouraged to just borrow the money. No one knows what a part-time job is. I'm not saying no one. Certainly we have students. We can't find work studies.
Right.
And people are paying $73,000 a year to get an education where I work. And it's ridiculous. It's a resort mentality.
Yes.
You have retail stores that are put in by Sodexo. You have Starbucks. You have Einstein's. You have these retail kiosks of designer food that is all on borrowed money. And again, students are going to Cancun on spring break on borrowed university money.
Roger.
They're going skiing in the wintertime on borrowed university money.
Yes. Yeah. Roger.
It's criminal.
It is. And this is great information. And actually, before you hang up, I want Blake to get your number because this is something we talk about all the time on my show because really the answer is, as you're saying, fix K through 12 because right now, as you mentioned, in states like Oregon, they're graduating students without any proof that they've met any sort of, basic level reading and writing. And you're right. We are just sending these kids all the way through, not us, but the institutions, and burdening them with huge debt. And they are being failed on every single front. We're coming to the end of the show, so I'm going to have to let you go, Roger, but stay on the line and Blake will get your information if you're open to that, because I'd love to have you on and talk more about that. Your perspective is very valued because you see it from the inside out. Thank you so much for calling in.
Thanks. Have a great day. Bye.
You too. Thank you so much. Well, I appreciate that call because that is really the reason why my husband and I made the documentary, Whose Children Are They? If you've seen it, thank you. If not, share it. Not because you get rich and famous for making a documentary, especially when it takes on the teachers' unions, but it is a tool for us to talk to our neighbors. This is a school board election year, and children are being failed when it comes to the basic academics, and then instead, they're being indoctrinated. That's another part of this entire process. So I really appreciate Roger calling in and highlighting that. And you can find that documentary at whosechildrenarethey.com. Well, I wanted to conclude the show because it's rapidly approaching where we began the conversation this morning. And that's really about the importance of free speech, because we see now on every single major front in our culture, it is getting challenged. You just have to look at, okay, on the political front, you have Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was just testifying in front of the committee that is hearing about government censorship. And of all people, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, I didn't even know she was still around, but obviously she still is. She was over the DNC for a while. Literally tried to shut him down when he was invited to speak. And he had this great line. He said, there is a censoring in a hearing about censorship. That's how crazy it is in the political world. Then you have the artistic and creative world, the entertainment world. You got Jason Aldean. We talked about that. His song, Try That in a Small Town, they're making up all kind of lies of what it's about in order to silence a viewpoint on the merits of a community that doesn't put up with the kind of rioting that was happening in 2020 in most of the big cities. That's on the entertainment front. Or they're trying to disparage Sound of Freedom, which just passed $100 million. And the statistic I was going to share, that is so significant because that movie increased 37% in its second weekend. That's the do or die weekend when it comes to a movie being released. My husband and I had been in the industry previously. We still are. We make movies. And there's only been 10 movies in all of movie history that have increased more than 35% in their second weekend. And Sound of Freedom is one of those. All other 9 were at Christmas time. So that is phenomenal because it shows that people are not listening to the political and the entertainment elite and the cultural elite. They're trying to censor these kind of views. Then you have Lori Smith. She was on my show yesterday talking about the 303 Creative case, the big win in the Supreme Court for freedom of speech, and the flip side of that, the ruling against government-compelled speech. Those are two sides of the same coin. And what's happened to Lori Smith? Since this ruling, she has been attacked with such vitriol and hatred by the left who want to silence her that she's had death threats. She doesn't even let her daughter play in the front yard anymore. She's had her address given out. She's been doxxed online, all of that. There is a huge attempt, like I have not seen before, to silence differing views. That's really the battlefield of our day. And here's the good news. It is a battlefield where every single one of us can make a difference. I love the fact that we talk about rights and we say we exercise our rights. We exercise our First Amendment rights. And that's important because it is like a muscle. Use it or lose it. And every single one of us can exercise our First Amendment rights. I want to end with this. I started with some quotes at the beginning of the show, 6 a.m. You can hear it on the podcast at 710knus.com. And, George Washington said, if the freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter. That was at our founding. They understood what it was like to be under a monarchy and a rule by fiat and tyranny. You then move forward and you look at what our freedom of speech has inspired. Many of you may remember the name Benazir Bhutto. She was the first first female prime minister of Pakistan in a very, very patriarchal system and an Islamic rule. And she fought for freedom. She fought for women's rights. She was arrested numerous times, eventually elected prime minister, and was eventually assassinated by Al-Qaeda. But what did she say about the inspiration of America? She said, America's greatest contribution to the world is its concept of democracy, its concept of freedom, freedom of action, freedom of speech, and freedom of thought. That's how big it is. And if we want to help other areas of the world, if we understand what is at stake, we will remember one of my favorite quotes. This is from Daniel Webster. When I think about our freedom of speech, our rights, he said, "Miracles do not cluster. What has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there will be anarchy throughout the world." We have to hold fast to the Constitution. We have to exercise and practice our rights, because if not, we will lose them just by attrition. We'll lose them by allowing the mob to bully us into silence. But if we don't, then we win the day, because truth is powerful. All we have to do is speak it unapologetically. That's why I end every one of my shows with these words: be bold, be courageous. God bless you. I'm Deborah Flora, News Talk 710 KNUS.